Henry still couldn't believe that he found himself in this amazing place. This world was like a cell of one giant sect, and now, with mixed feelings, he looked through the sights at the High Priestess, who was worshipped by thousands. The woman raised her stick with the magic crystal, and everything around was illuminated with pink light. Her fans immediately began to noisily respond, their voices merging into a loud noise. It seemed like Henry was watching some very important ritual right now. But the religion of these eccentrics did not interest him in the least. The man had a goal to get home as quickly as possible, so the priestess became a target along the way. The sniper took aim directly at the woman's head and prepared to shoot. He slowed his breathing as much as possible, and at the right moment, he pulled the trigger. The bullet flew forward rapidly, overcoming all obstacles but leaving him invisible to outsiders. Henry watched the consequences of his actions with concentration. The bullet pierced the crystal and hit the woman's head, and the ritual was interrupted. In complete silence, the top of the stick fell apart, and the energy that was lurking inside the stone burst out. The entire structure of the temple shook and began to collapse, and the crowd began to run in all directions. Henry breathed a sigh of relief. Now he needed to change his location. He rose from his camouflaged hiding place and slowly began to move in the opposite direction of the target. Therefore, the man did not immediately notice how the monsters hiding under the cloaks around the priestess became angry. They threw off their cloaks and rushed in pursuit of the sniper. This threatened to cause really big problems, because the lack of ammunition was given as a sign, and there were too many enemies. Henry started to run. There was no point in disguise now. Soon, the first monster reached the place where the shot was fired and found a cartridge case. But an experienced soldier could leave traces only because he wanted to trap the enemy. The priestess's murtads exploded on the grenade, not even having time to react to the threat. This stopped the others, who looked around in confusion, fearing that they would be next. Soon one of the pursuers noticed Henry's trajectory, and the chase continued with renewed vigor. The man ran away at the maximum speed possible, taking into account the weight of his ammunition and weapons. But the threat was getting closer. The monster could already be seen with the naked eye at a distance of 200 meters. The one closest to the military individual suddenly jumped, but the retreat was calculated. Henry crossed the ravine using a pre-stretched rope, leaving the creatures behind. Those who risked jumping into the abyss after him awaited a logical end. To finally protect himself, the soldier began shooting at moving targets. Fortunately, he was a skilled marksman, and those who were not killed by the fall from a height were killed by bullets. Henry was not afraid of hellish clashes, especially with such opponents. Having reached the ground, the man stopped. He wanted to make sure that he was safe. When another monster rushed at him from the bushes, it did not come as a surprise to the military man. He jumped up with a knife and began to strike his opponent in the body with sharp movements. He had been in this world long enough to understand the weaknesses of the inhabitants here. In addition, what could not be completed by hand could always be solved with weapons. For a specialist from the South Korean army, such clashes were child's play. Returning home was Henry's top priority, and he was willing to do anything to achieve his goal. An unfamiliar world with danger at almost every step did not give time for respite. And now, the man was again moving in the direction of his shelter. Today, he hoped he was one step closer to completing the mission. But the murder of such an important figure here was bound to exacerbate his already precarious situation. On dark nights, the appointed specialist often recalled the last events before the move. He was on another mission on a pirate island somewhere in Indonesia. It was necessary to eliminate the villains by order of the state. He was not interested in the details. The main thing was that he had attracted attention. The pirates were approaching, and they decided to make a detour, suspecting that there was an enemy nearby. There were about 10 of them, and the bandits moved in a checkerboard pattern, not moving far from each other. As the enemy approached his position, Henry received a signal from command in his earpiece. An evacuation from the island was announced due to the completion of all assigned tasks. But now, with the pirates almost surrounding him on all sides, it was impossible to demand leadership. All that was left was to wait for the right moment. While none of the enemies noticed him, the tall grass and camouflage did their job. But in case of failure, It was impossible to deal with all the villains without a fatal outcome. Henry was frantically trying to come up with a strategy for a successful exit. But no matter how hard he tried, he could only hope for luck and act according to the situation. Several men came very close to the sniper, but none of them saw the appointed specialist. Henry braced himself for a possible escalation of the conflict and grabbed his knife. The soldier tried to breathe as slowly as possible so as not to reveal his location. And then, a few seconds later, the foot of one of the pirates was right next to his shoulder. The second one appeared very close to the first one. The first part of the group passed by without noticing the enemy. But that was only half the battle. Henry spent a few seconds catching his breath. Sweat poured down his forehead from the strain. Just when the man thought that this task would probably end without a fight, the voice of the signalman interrupted everything. The message in the earpiece seemed loud in the silence of the night. The sniper realized that everyone nearby had heard him. His position was now discredited. He quickly jumped to his feet and rushed at the pirate who was closest. He relied only on his machine gun, and that was a mistake. The knife blade hit the enemy straight in the throat, cutting his vocal cords. Following the first, the appointed specialist immediately dealt with the second. But it was not possible to avoid the noise. The rest of the pirates who had gone ahead heard the sounds of the fight. Rivers of balls poured down on Henry, from which he had to quickly run away. The villains rained lead on him, and all that was left was to hope that the rest of the group had not left. While running away, the soldier understood perfectly well that he would not be able to cope on his own, without reinforcements. The persecution did not stop until the trap he had prepared in advance for an emergency. He skillfully learned to camouflage mines in medium terrain. Fortunately, the pirates were so busy with their own goal that they did not see the moment when they themselves became victims. The explosion was powerful enough to give the special forces time to escape. He took full advantage of his chance, answering into his earphone as he went. Now the man was worried about the fate of the rest of the group, so he was ready to sacrifice himself. Of course, this didn't mean lying down and dying, but distracting the bandits was a good idea in his opinion. As the squad captain, the sniper had the right to give orders, but this time they did not want to follow them. I also had to argue while running and justify my point of view. It was a pirate island, and there were too many of them behind him now to resist. The only option to save lives was to run in the opposite direction from the group, distract attention, and wait for the return of the rescue team. So the whole night was spent on the run. Eventually, Henry managed to find a beautiful, almost invisible cave deep in the steep slope. He hid there, hoping that his pursuers had lost track of him. 4 days passed in anticipation, and the man was so tense that he couldn't sleep a wink. The psyche worked at the limits of human capabilities. Henry was amazed that he was still conscious. He laid out all his belongings and made a thorough inspection. Arsenal left much to be desired, and we need to start from reality. When fatigue began to take its toll, the Special Forces soldiers suddenly heard a noise nearby. Of course, the uninvited guests turned out to be pirates who were on the other side of the gorge. The sniper's first ball pierced the chest of one of the villains. There was no other choice, even though it meant saying goodbye to sleep for an indefinite period. Sleep now meant inevitable death. Looking at the photo of his family on the screen of his dying tablet, Henry mentally said goodbye to them. His mother and sister were probably waiting for him at home. A military man could not simply raise these expectations and hopes. The man was brought out of his thoughts by a sound that could not be confused with anything. The grenade had already been loaded into the RPG and was aimed straight at his cave. It was necessary to urgently run away from the exit. The specialist grabbed all his things and ran into the depths of the cave. The pirate fired his shot. Henry saw the grenade flying towards him. He understood that he might not make it in time and got ready. He couldn't believe that this was how his life would end. By some miracle, the specialist managed to run 20 meters away from the exit of the cave. The grenade landed right behind him. The man jumped forward, and the blast wave picked him up on its wings. Henry rode like a coachman into the dark unknown. The powerful explosion caused the rock beneath our feet to crack and create a chasm. Given the soldier's luck up to this point, it was to be expected that he would fall inside. And so it happened. Fortunately, death passed him by, but the injuries seemed serious. My head ached unbearably, causing my vision to become clouded. Concentrating on his surroundings, Henry suddenly saw a strange bas-relief in front of him. The words etched into the rock were written in an unknown language, and a demon completed it. Disconcerted by what he saw, the man could not bear the load and lost consciousness. When this happened, changes began to take place in the cave. The eyes of the monster sitting on the mysterious bas-relief shone with a bright light. Gradually, this light penetrated into every corner of the cave and hid the uninvited guest within itself. It is not known exactly how long it took Henry to come to his senses. He looked around. His health had improved significantly, so he needed to take care of protection. Seeing a rifle not far from him, the sniper rushed towards it. He took a favorable position that would protect his back from unexpected attacks. Once the initial shock had passed, the pain in my shoulder made itself known. This was not a good sign, because if he was injured, he was in even greater danger. Having adjusted a little to the lack of light, Henry managed to get a detailed look at the strange artifact in front of him. The demon's eyes no longer glowed, but the sinister smile brought ants all over his body. It is obvious that the bas-relief and the statue of the monster were man-made. Having recovered a little from the state of shock, the sniper decided to focus on something more important: his own salvation. Life went on, so it was necessary to continue fighting, despite the circumstances. Henry decided to try to establish contact with his team. The hope was weak, but after another attempt, it completely faded away. After several unsuccessful radio operations, the sniper abandoned this losing cause. He again, involuntarily, focused on the demon that seemed to be staring at him from the dark depths of the cave. Since there was no signal here at all, and the presence of the sculpture was overwhelming, the man decided to get out. He climbed onto the rocks blocking the exit, but did not expect to see what was behind it. The appointed specialist even froze in place out of surprise. Before him was a completely fantasy landscape: flying pieces of land and giant trees. It was completely different from what he saw before the grenade flew away from him. The pirate island that the sniper explored before the operation did not look like this. It didn't fit in my head. After a few minutes of observation, Henry even thought that he had hit his head hard. But when he looked up and saw two suns at the zenith, the military man finally realized that this was not Earth. He was shocked. In fact, it is unknown how someone would react to this if they were in his place. Panic is the worst enemy in unpredictable situations. So the man decided to focus on spatial orientation, but the compass did not point north. It felt like the specialist's situation was becoming more difficult with each passing minute. Since he had been transported to an unknown world in a cave, Henry eventually decided to return there. He descended into it along the same proven path that he had ascended. But, to my surprise, I saw that significant changes had taken place inside as well. Now the stone tablet with the demon looked completely new. They looked like an altar. The monster itself in this world had golden ornaments, horns, and fangs. This confirmed, at first glance, the absurd theory of the forced visitor. After sitting for a while in thought, the man decided to take stock of his own weapons. He grabbed his backpack. Focused on his goal, Henry didn't even realize that he was not alone in the cave. He still had a Claymore anti-personnel mine with him. Explosives are a lifesaver in difficult situations. Unnecessary. The man found a map of a pirate island inside. 7 packets of dry rations were pleasing to the eye, although he could have been in this world for the rest of his life. Taking the tablet in his hands, Henry preferred with all his heart that it still work. It was a connection with his family. But it was all useless. The equipment probably died during the explosion. Bored by such injustice, the man did not consider the danger to himself. As the giant reptile got closer and closer, the assigned specialist began to count the ammunition. He had 2 magazines for his machine gun in his possession. A couple of grenades, but it's better than nothing at all. But the bullets from a sniper rifle, although few, could still protect him from a distance. Of course, weapons were added to all this. A machine gun and a sniper rifle were always with a soldier, regardless of the complexity of the situation. With all the ammunition laid out in front of him, Henry tried to figure out what to do next. It was necessary to save the cartridges more carefully, so that later you wouldn't have to fight for your life with a knife. A sudden noise right above his head finally caught the hero's attention. It was just a giant snake baring its teeth at him, preparing to swallow its prey. When the reptile realized that it had been noticed, it immediately rushed to attack. Henry's horror was genuine. It was the first time he had encountered such an opponent. The man started running, avoiding the collision. Putting more distance between the snake and himself, he stopped, assessing the situation. The enemy blocked the only passage to the street with his body. Therefore, it seemed impossible to avoid death without a fight. And Henry decided to fight. He raised his machine gun. Having carefully analyzed the snake's weaknesses, the man decided where to shoot. A moment later, the sounds of machine gun fire were heard. All the bullets flew into the snake's tongue, which was already aimed at the man. And although the freak screamed in pain, he still found an effective way to counterattack. With her tail, she knocked the ground out from under the sniper's feet. The man rolled on the ground, hoping that he would have time to regroup. Unfortunately, the specialist targeted the wrong place to hit the opponent, and control over the weapons was lost. Using all the dexterity he could muster, the soldier found himself next to the rifle. His next shot hit the snake in the head, as close as possible to one of the eyes. Sniper weapons were better suited to hitting targets at a distance. The pain the anaconda experienced was significant. It made her stop and consider her prospects. Before her was a small opponent, an ideal prey if not for his resistance. The monster's last attempt at intimidation was not successful. The soldier didn't even move from his spot. The snake realized that Henry would not back down. He would fight to the end. And this meant that injuries and wounds on her part were inevitable. Having experienced a bullet from a sniper rifle once, the attacker did not want to repeat it. Therefore, contrary to her desires and instincts, she resorted to a shameful flight. Henry, in turn, did not lower his weapon until the tip of the freak's tail had completely disappeared. Only then was the man able to breathe out calmly. This world was surprising him more and more with every passing second. Predzinen decided not to wait for a new attacker and to examine the planet more carefully. Having collected his things, the soldier again began to climb towards the exit. Once on the mountain, Henry's goal was to focus his attention on searching for an intelligent civilization. All that was visible around was forest, and among the trees there was only one that was significantly different. It looked like a baobab, so the sniper decided to move in that direction. The height of the giant plant could allow one to feel safe and explore the environment. The climb to the top of the tree took about an hour, but it was worth it. Through the binocular lenses, huge chunks of land were visible, simply hanging in the air above the dense forest. The unknown frightened the military man even more. The green thickets could hide many unknown predators, and the two suns above our heads have not disappeared, reminding us of the unknown nature of this place. The route Henry took to get here remained a secret to him, which created additional tension, especially considering that he saw nothing around that would indicate that there were people nearby. But, unexpectedly, the man saw some strange building in the distance. It didn't look like a house, but it still looked like it was artificial. The distance from the baobab tree to the black building was approximately 70 kilometers. Dry water might be enough for this distance, but something had to be done about water. Fortunately, there was a water artery flowing near the tree, and although its purity was unknown, it was the only chance. When the household chores were almost done, doubts about the safety of such an expedition again filled Henry's mind. In the end, the man decided to set out on his journey tomorrow morning and look around the tree today. Carefully descending to the ground, all he did was turn his head in all directions. There were some fireflies flying around. They were poking around everywhere in the lush thickets. Having walked around the tree in a circle within a radius of 100 meters, the specialist was determined to make sure that the horizon was clear. Just in case, since he would be sleeping on the mountain, it was necessary to take care of a trap below. For this, explosives were unnecessary. It was enough to collect thin brushwood. The soldier scattered his findings at the roots of the baobab tree. This should have allowed him to detect the enemy's approach in advance and prepare. Having carefully completed everything that was planned, the man climbed the tree again. Having settled down comfortably, he prepared himself for the sleep he had been longing for 4 unbearable days. But the unexpected appearance of an airship overhead ruined his plans. This meant that there was a civilization of intelligent beings here after all. Henry immediately decided to test his guesses using binoculars. And indeed, he saw something interesting in the lenses. There stood not just a rational being, it was a real man. A man on deck. The sniper's rifle scope magnified the image better, and the soldier could see more details. It was a man in strange clothes, reminiscent of the Roman Empire, surrounded by servants. The airship flew towards the man-made black structure. The Special Forces soldier looked after him, completely confident that he had chosen the right path for tomorrow. He hardly slept the rest of the night. Henry was captivated by the idea of people like him being here. When the two suns had barely begun to appear on the horizon, the man had already climbed down from the tree and set off on his journey. He moved rather cautiously, already trained in the possible dangers along the way. The airship was also a big surprise, something that could only be seen on Earth in the 19th century. About an hour passed, and Henry finally reached the river he had seen from above. It was quite wide and the water seemed incredibly clear. But this could be a deceptive impression. Military experience was given as a sign. Since there was no way to check the quality and there were no other options nearby, Henry took the plunge. He scooped up a handful of water in his hands and raised it to his mouth. After drinking the first portion, the man breathed a sigh of relief. Everything went well. The substance did not contain any poison at first glance. But that didn't mean we had to let our guard down. The Special Purpose was amazed by the landscapes he observed along the way. By the river, everything looked even more futuristic. He washed his face and drank to his heart's content, after which his body seemed to get a second wind. But when Henry raised his head, he froze in place. A strange eye, at the end of a giant tentacle, looked at him straight from the water. The creature that emerged opposite him did not move, but simply watched. When the initial shock had passed, the man jumped to his feet and grabbed his machine gun. He had not planned to shoot, given the shortage of ammunition, but he was prepared for it. Especially when others began to emerge next to the first eye. The creatures gradually began to approach. Henry felt an ever-increasing sense of danger in his midst. The creatures watched him closely so as not to miss a single movement of the man. The Special Forces soldier felt like prey. The soldier began to move along the riverbed, but the strange tentacles continued to pursue him. This attention was quite intrusive, so Henry also did not light the creature's eye in order to protect himself. Suddenly, a noise ahead caused both of them to be distracted from their work. The soldier dropped to the ground, preparing for a possible skirmish. Something in the bushes was rapidly moving towards the water. The creature that was chasing the man instantly disappeared into the depths of the river. At that very second, a wild boar jumped out of the thicket onto the shore. It was quite a large specimen. Much larger than the standard male, the wild pig, ignoring the man, approached the watering hole. Henry was truly amazed by its size. He knew that if he was noticed, it would not be easy to escape. Meanwhile, the boar fell to the water and greedily tried to quench his thirst. He did not immediately notice the eye of the creature, which again cautiously emerged from the depths of the river. Henry decided to see what would happen next. Seeing the danger ahead, the wild pig stopped drinking and tried to rush back to the thicket. He screamed furiously on the road, and the man realized that it was an inexpressible horror before the predator. The tentacle rushed after its prey. It grabbed the boar by the rear whip. The creature continued to resist, so several more were added to the first. It was now clear that all the tentacles belonged to one creature. In a matter of seconds, she dragged the wild pig to the bottom of the river. Henry could only watch the bubbles appear on the surface of the water. When the beast's resistance ended, one of the unknown creature's tentacles appeared in front of the special agent again. The others followed the first one, and it was clear that the creature wanted to attack Henry. The soldier could not tolerate such abuse against himself, so he decided to attack first. He fired a couple of balls towards the eye itself. It turned out that the blood of the unknown predator is purple. It was a well-aimed shot, and in an instant, the monster that had been waiting in the depths looked out with terrible screams. Once her pain had subsided a little, it became obvious that the creature was planning revenge. But Henry only clutched the weapon in his hands even tighter, showing with his whole appearance that he was ready for battle. It worked the same way as with the giant snake. Soon, the predator disappeared, finally admitting his defeat. The danger had passed, and it was possible to concentrate on one's goal. The nature of this amazing place confused the military man more and more every day. Several days had passed since the incident on the river, and during this time, Henry had suffered a lot. He expected to reach the tower in less than 5 days, but he had already been wandering through the jungle for 6 days. The tower was still visible ahead, but the path to it was very difficult. The specialists had to climb up the cliffs and trees to get at least a little rest from the dangers. He even managed to take a nap a couple of times because his consciousness could not withstand such excessive stress. Besides the river monster, there were many deadly traps in the jungle itself. Giant predatory flowers that popped up among the inconspicuous forest glades. Earthworms that tried to eat him when the sniper passed through the ravines. All this seemed to scream at him that this planet was not created for human life. In addition, the deer man never once saw even a small source of food for himself. At a short distance from the tower, it turned out that it was black and not white. The material from which it was built resembled some expensive variety of marble. In fact, it took another day and a half to 2 days to get to her, and only crumbs remained from the last dry one. Henry was now completely unpretentious, and this dinner satisfied him. Even these handfuls of unprecedented luxury became Michelin-starred food for the man. Even though he saw individuals that looked like humans, that didn't mean they were identical to Earthlings. Special care must also be taken when in contact with them. The next day, the man managed to reach what seemed to be the last frontier, a field with tall grass. Visually, the area did not look threatening along the entire horizon, but this could be a deceptive impression. Although Henry had a bad feeling about this path, he had no choice but to move forward. Gritting his teeth, the specialist assigned to him slowly took one step at a time. All around there were only the sounds of nature and the rustling of grass. Apart from him, there was not a soul around. Somewhere in the middle of the field, suddenly, everything changed. Behind and in front of Henry, the characteristic sounds of an approaching creature could be heard. The man raised his machine gun and got ready. It was difficult to fight against someone you couldn't see, but it was certain that the sniper had already been surrounded. When the unknown creatures began to move, narrowing the circle, the soldier began to shoot back. It didn't help much, so the movement continued, and there were no sounds of pain. When it was time to reload the magazine, suddenly one of the creatures jumped out of the tall thickets. In this situation, it was impossible to mess around with a machine gun, so Henry took up the pistol. Having fired the shot, he felt relief along with joy. The unknown creature, resembling some kind of giant mole, was successfully eliminated. When the body of the first fell to the ground, the rest immediately rushed to attack. Henry managed to get a clear shot at only 2 of his opponents, but the rest managed to escape. They waited for a more suitable time, but the specialist did not agree to this. It was necessary to come up with something more radical to resist. This successful strategy turned out to be a grenade that the man threw towards the ambush. The explosion had deprived him of the last of his pursuers, or so he thought. But soon, a new batch of moles appeared nearby. This time, the soldier did not know what to do because he was already running out of ammunition. The end of the field of tall grass was not yet visible, and this meant possible death from the teeth of the monsters. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to another strange sound, the source of which was not visible. Large, toothy moles also noticed the loud grinding sound. In a moment, there was not a single predator left around the man. This could only mean one thing. There was someone more dangerous moving around somewhere nearby. This hypothesis was confirmed a minute later by the appearance of his real giant. It was a stone creature with glowing eyes, 100 times larger than a man. She moved straight towards the sniper and he locked onto the spot. An ordinary person with a firearm could not do anything against such a colossus. It was too late to run. The stone giant was heading straight for Henry. All that was left for the sniper to do was to prepare a trap with the most devastating consequences. He took an anti-personnel mine out of his backpack. Having placed it in the enemy's path of advance, the man began to run. Having secured himself as much as possible, Henry could only wait for the result. A minute later, the man saw a giant foot landing directly on an anti-personnel mine. The Special Forces soldier held his breath and pressed the detonator he was holding in his hand. An explosion occurred. The stone monster fell to the ground, unable to move any longer. One could say that it was a victory. This came as a big surprise to both Henry and his opponent. It was necessary to urgently consolidate the unexpected result, and for this, the sniper chose a grenade. It hit right into the second, then still intact leg. Now the opponent should have no chance to recover. But the result of the specialist's actions turned out to be unpredictably fatal for the stone giant. In fact, in a moment, he turned into a pile of stones. Now Henry was free to move forward without fear for his own safety. After just a couple of minutes, the man left the field with tall grass and went deeper into the forest. He didn't look back, so he didn't see that something strange had happened there. All that remained of the confused monster continued to stare after him. At some point, a bright golden portal materialized above the stone giant's head. A man in a white rabbit mask flew out through it onto a field of tall grass. She watched in amazement as the aftermath of the violent skirmish that led to the destruction of the monster. It turned out that it was very difficult to cope with the stone creature, even for the locals. Therefore, the interest in the newly arrived alien shooter became almost irresistible. The White Rabbit decided to follow the dangerous warrior. Henry did not see his pursuer and did not even suspect that he had come into the field of vision of interested parties. A day and a half of travel turned into 2, and the tower still remained just as far away. The Special Forces soldier hoped that he would be able to reach the object before he fell exhausted. There was some noise ahead, and Henry immediately took aim to see who was there. The soldier couldn't believe his eyes. The thermal imager showed that the man was ahead. Suddenly, the unknown person started moving. The sniper tried to track his trajectory, but it was very difficult because the object had a high speed and often changed its trajectory. Henry barely had time to turn the sight from side to side. It turned out that a woman was walking towards him, and she was armed. For the first time in this world, a man saw another person so closely. The stranger was aggressive and started saying something, but what was unclear. It was an unknown language to a South Korean. But the man understood perfectly well that the matter was obvious. He had a weapon in his hands. He lowered his machine gun, thus showing that he had no intention of engaging in a confrontation. The stranger seemed to take this gesture in the right way. A second later, Henry lost sight of her, and another cold blade from a potential opponent touched the back of his neck. Reflexively, the sniper immediately grabbed his pistol. But he realized in time that any wrong move, and he would remain lying in this forest as a corpse. Besides, he didn't want to kill the first person, losing the chance to understand where exactly he was. It was necessary to somehow establish communication. The woman continued to say something and circle around the strange man, who was not even disguised. She realized that he was different from the locals. This was evident even from his clothes. Eventually, the woman faced a dilemma: destroy the stranger or capture him. The portal behind her appeared unexpectedly. Through him, the White Rabbit materialized again and warned his comrade of the danger. Of course, Henry didn't understand what they were talking about, but he saw how surprised his interlocutor was. Meanwhile, the White Rabbit told about his discovery in the field of tall grass. This news brought a sudden silence to the clearing. The sword lover couldn't get her head around the fact that the guy in front of her could pose a serious threat. But from the comrade's story, it became clear that the eccentrics needed to be eliminated. Despite the White Rabbit's denial, she rushed forward. Henry pulled out a gun. He didn't want to shoot, but his life was threatened. That's why the finger pressed the trigger before the brain did what it did. It was the instinct of self-preservation. The attacker saw a strange object flying towards her. She felt that she needed to be careful. When the bullet was in dangerous quantities, the protective shield was activated. In this way, the woman tried to protect herself, but it turned out to be a futile idea, because the shield shattered into small pieces. Luckily, the strange object also lost its speed and simply fell to the ground. This time, death passed the warrior by. She froze in surprise. Henry did the same out of surprise. He didn't want the situation to get so out of control. But, as it turned out, he provoked his opponent even more. That the opponent had extraordinary abilities became obvious within a moment. The stormy flow of energy almost rejected the special appointee back, no matter how he tried to resist. Even the White Rabbit was shocked by the power of aggression and began to worry about himself. He quickly put up a protective barrier, hoping it would be enough to avoid damage. But he overestimated his strength. The girl's energy strike worked well in both directions. Moreover, it has only just begun to accelerate. Henry begged for this horror to stop, realizing that no one present knew what he had said. This didn't bother him. He tried to use all available opportunities to calm his opponent. The female warrior didn't even look in his direction. She was focused on her goal. The native accumulated all her strength to eliminate her opponent. The Special Forces soldier, not losing hope, continued to beg for an end to this hell. But it seemed that his attempts were backfired even more. Eventually, the woman suddenly changed tactics and began to rapidly approach, wanting hand-to-hand combat. She, like the White Rabbit, did not immediately notice the protective barrier around the foreigner, and this turned out to be a fatal mistake. The White Rabbit, like the girl, could not stay in their places and were thrown several meters away. Raising his head, the rabbit saw that only golden sparks remained of the protective barrier. The woman was already standing on her feet and bowing to the blurry figure in the fog. It was the same man Henry had seen on the airship, the stranger's feet not touching the ground. Judging by the reaction of the attacker, this strikingly handsome nobleman was higher in rank than her. The sniper continued to aim his pistol at his opponents, but the sleeping spell the group's leader had cast on him was more powerful than his desire to protect himself. After some time, the local trios sat around the fire, looking at the military man bound by magic. The head of the group was interested in the well-being of the girl sitting to his left, but of course, she answered that everything was fine, not realizing that in fact the other person was not happy. He watched his guard closely, and finally he noticed that she was too hot-tempered and reckless. The White Rabbit was quick to take all the blame on himself, believing that he had provoked the fight. But the ruler was unapproachable, and they had already been in danger for a long time. He couldn't let his people, his only remaining friends, be put in danger. After a short silence, the three began to speculate about the identity of the eccentric on Earth. They agreed that he was definitely a foreigner. This was evidenced by the lack of knowledge of the language and a suspicious weapon that no one had seen before. The rabbit said that he had seen the destructive potential of these objects and that they were amazingly deadly. The woman was outraged by her friend's infatuation with a stranger and took it personally, but no one took her reaction into account, continuing to analyze the arsenal unconscious. No one doubted the military man's skill, and the sleep spell spared them unnecessary problems. But the warrior, whose name, by the way, was Ember, could no longer tolerate the presence of a potential enemy. She certainly wanted to take revenge and rehabilitate herself in the eyes of her master. While Henry was peacefully muttering something in his sleep about returning home, the leader of the group had the intention of waking him up for questioning. He was afraid of being persecuted by Bishop Isabel. The White Rabbit did not deny it, but, on the contrary, agreed to this adventure. He offered a worthy way out of the situation to boot. With the help of one of the spells he knew, the language barrier could be removed. When all the nuances had been discussed and clarified, Henry was finally allowed to open his eyes. The husband immediately felt that he could not move. A voice above his head suggested that he calm down and abandon his plans to fight. The sniper looked in that direction. He saw familiar faces of local residents. The nobleman said something in an unknown language. The White Rabbit, calling him a prince, translated the questions. They were interested in Henry's origins. The specialist did not know whether to answer because he had no guarantee that he would remain alive. The only correct solution in this situation was to calm his nerves a little, which is what actually got the prisoner fired up. The White Rabbit repeated his question. This time Henry responded by giving his name, rank, and nationality. To the locals, almost everything he said sounded like nonsense. There was silence on the lawn, which the soldier happily took advantage of. It was his turn to ask questions. He asked about his location, and the rabbit willingly translated this to the ruler. A few seconds later, he replied with a smile that this continent was called Lanos, and he was Prince Leo. This remark finally confirmed Henry's worst suspicions. He was not on Earth. Hearing this word, the White Rabbit became interested. He thought that this was some unknown continent. But the captive's astonished face spoke for itself. The man didn't even suspect what names his interlocutor was listing. The only hope left was that the soldier was here on his own, without reinforcements. Feeling something was wrong, Henry renewed his attempts to quit. But it was all useless. Only the sorcerer, who was waiting for answers to his questions, could stop these efforts. In fact, the White Rabbit had already stopped considering the captive dangerous. He no longer emitted aggression. It seemed that he was showing in every way that he did not want to fight to the death, but rather was holding back his opponents. And as much as Amber liked it, the military man's arsenal encouraged him to think that he had a significant advantage. The short time the rabbit watched the alien showed the destructive power it was capable of. The conversation had to be interrupted due to an attack by enemies. The warrior was the first to react. When she rushed to attack, the sorcerer still could not understand what had happened. Arrows flew out of the forest and immediately brought the White Rabbit to his senses. These were Bishop Isabel's apostates. Amber tried her best to keep the prince safe, but she was unable to reflect all the arrows flying into the clearing. Leo did not want to remain on the sidelines and resolutely joined his comrades. The first creature in a cloak came out onto the lawn after just a couple of minutes. The White Rabbit called them Templars. They were creatures who hid their true appearance behind clothes. They were heading straight for the prince. Obviously, he was their main target. Amber couldn't allow this, so she immediately rushed to Leo's defense. He himself could fight skillfully. He was a strong and brave warrior. While everyone was resorting to physical contact, the White Rabbit was trying to cast a spell. He had to avoid many confrontations with the bishop's freaks. The situation was getting worse. The number of opponents on the lawn already numbered more than 10. It was necessary to retreat and do it urgently. It was impossible for the three of us to cope with such a horde on our own. No one listened to Henry begging for his dismissal. He was ready to help. The man insisted on his participation because he understood perfectly well the difficulty of the situation and did not want to die. The White Rabbit was hesitant and looked at Amber. But the girl was busy with her struggle and did not take everything else into account. Just like Prince Leo, there was no free time to meet. The rabbit himself was very eager for the opportunity to perform magic in peace. He needed someone to have his back. There were no options left, especially when one of the Templars tried to kill the appointed specialist. Fortunately, this assassination attempt was ineffective and Henry survived. There was no more risk to be taken. The White Rabbit received the seal and activated it. The dismissal took a few seconds, which promised to be too tense. Literally, both heroes were in mortal danger. The sorcerer was focused on the spell. He ignored the sniper's cries of horror. Eventually, the seal worked. Henry managed to regroup at the last moment. He needed to get to his weapon, so he had to eliminate one of the attackers on the way. It turned out that by kicking his opponent, he threw off his hood. The man screamed in shock. It was not a man, but a giant lizard. The White Rabbit's remark that this was a familiar type of Templar did not take away the shock. There was no time for more detailed explanations. It was necessary to protect the sorcerer while he was doing something extremely important, generating a spell. In confirmation of this, the next Templars attacked the specialist from behind. The man managed to dodge the attack and ran in the direction of his weapon. He picked up the rifle, and he looked through the scope, assessing the situation. The girl barely held on, defending her foothold from the enemies. But, like Leo, she noticed that the former prisoner had already been freed and had managed to arm himself. All that was required was to choose which direction was best to shoot. The trio of warriors stood frozen, waiting for Henry's decision. When he finally chose the first target, he did not waste any more time. The Special Forces soldier resolutely pulled the trigger, and a shot rang out. In a short period of time, he dropped a few more balls. Leo reacted instantly. He rushed into the attack, not allowing the Templars to break through to the sniper. Unfortunately, things were not going very smoothly. Several individuals were rapidly approaching in the direction of the military man. They even managed to raise their weapons over his face. Amber came to the aid of the newcomer. She eliminated the opponents from behind. The woman prudently decided to deal with her personal problems later. The White Rabbit, meanwhile, concentrated on his work. Feeling almost invincible, Amber sought to kill as many Templars as possible. But in the heat of battle, she didn't take into account that she was left without cover behind her. Luckily, Henry came to the rescue and repaid the debt for saving his life. As much as the warrior liked it, it had to be admitted that the foreigner was very clever. Eventually, all members of the group, except the White Rabbit, ended up back to back, which was the most advantageous maneuver. The sorcerer, meanwhile, had almost completed the creation of a powerful, devastating spell. But the Templars were not willing to restrain themselves either. They became increasingly aggressive. Fatigue from constant clashes has already begun to show as signs. All hopes were pinned on the White Rabbit, which promised relief. Somewhere in the depths of the bushes, a strange sound appeared, as if someone big was moving there. Amber immediately realized that these were the sounds of the Gate of Bloody Mason, a rather unpleasant creature. Only Henry didn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, all the Templars stopped and lined up, forming an impromptu passage. The picture looked, in a sense, even ominous, considering that the sniper did not know this world at all. The only thing that reassured him was that his forced comrades also looked worried, especially Prince Leo, who felt responsible for those gathered. Bloody Mason was a giant who looked like he was created in the mouth of a volcano. His head was reinforced with armor to prevent quick reprisals from his enemies. Of course, the monster was also determined to destroy the noble person. He raised his axe above his head, preparing for a powerful blow. But the Special Forces bullet confused the monster a little. He had never encountered an opponent with such combat introduction techniques before. Amber screamed at the prince to retreat immediately, taking advantage of the opportunity. Bloody Mason ran forward, as if reacting to the sound of her voice. And although Leo seemed to have successfully jumped back, the warrior had to stand between the monster and the ruler. Everyone understood that they would not be able to hold out for long against such an opponent. The White Rabbit was not yet ready for active action. It was necessary to retreat, and only Henry thought about a possible strategy that could compensate for the difficult situation. He wanted to get to the rifle, and to do that, the soldier needed Amber's cover. Having reported this, and not waiting for an answer, he already rushed forward. It is unclear why, but Amber trusted the stranger. She flew up to the crooked mason and began to distract his attention to herself. All that was required was to hold out long enough. Meanwhile, Leo focused on exterminating the Templars who were still hanging around. Henry was so focused on his goal that he didn't notice the danger. Amber had to shout at the man to see how the Bloody Mason's axe was coming down on him. At the last moment, the soldier managed to regroup and rolled to the side. The giant was rather clumsy, so the team had some time. Luckily, the White Rabbit had already managed to complete the spell. He activated it with determination, intending to destroy all his enemies, one by one. This magic was called the Breath of the Earth, and now it illuminated the entire clearing. The giant monster began to close its eyes from the bright light, and the Templars stopped their attack. Soon the light dissipated into the air. At first, it seemed like the White Rabbit spell didn't work at all. All the monsters remained in their places. Bloody Mason, having recovered from the shock, finally turned his attention to the sorcerer flying in the air. He ran forward with the intention of destroying the only one who could give his opponents a chance to win. The Templars still stood there, as if watching what was happening. When the evil representatives became active, the earth around them arose. Henry sat down in fear and covered his head with his hands. It was the first time he had seen such amazing strength. But he soon realized that it was not directed against him. The White Rabbit's magic chose only enemies as its victims, and they could do nothing about it. Just in case, to protect his comrades, the sorcerer cast a protective spell on them. Therefore, not a single lump of earth fell on any of the three. A minute later, the situation on the lawn changed dramatically. Bloody Mason began to melt before our eyes. Along with him, the Templars gradually disappeared. In the end, there was no trace of the High Priestess's apostates left around. While Henry carefully examined the forest around him to make sure that the danger had passed. Exhausted, the White Rabbit began to fall to the ground unconscious. The use of such powerful magic had its effect on him. Amber caught the sorcerer almost at the last moment. She was very afraid for her comrade, just like Prince Leo. While the danger had passed them by, it was necessary to move on. The warrior was obliged to take care of the White Rabbit. It was necessary to buy time until the sorcerer fully recovered. Here and there along the way, the group found traces of the Templars' presence. Henry could only watch for signs that were obvious to others. And remember how to identify danger. The findings indicated that Prince Leo's group had withdrawn from all sides. For some reason, Amber thought they wanted to get it done before sunrise. They agreed that there were about 2,000 opponents, possibly including the Masons. Hearing about the crazy number of enemies, Henry couldn't take it anymore. He was interested in the plans of his new comrades. For some reason, the assigned specialist believed that at least some reinforcements should arrive in the morning. But his dream was shattered by harsh reality. The reason to finish off the prince at night was different. The Templars, like many other dark creatures, were fueled by the energy of the moon. They may have once been human, but now they have turned into real monsters. Henry still found it hard to believe, but Amber insisted that this was the work of the High Priestess, who had spread her sect. Now all of Elliot's followers have become his slaves, with some supernatural powers. Having learned all the nuances about the enemy's vulnerabilities, the appointed specialist began to think. A plan began to form in his mind. He needed to delay them longer, until the sun rose. Then people will have a chance to deal with the monsters while they are not feeding on the extra energy. The problem now was that the White Rabbit was still unconscious. It was necessary to break through possible ambushes and find a safe place before dawn. Leo suggested returning to the cave where they had spent the night yesterday, but at the speed they were going now, it would take too long to get there. An unexpected solution was proposed by Henry, who had been almost ignored during the meeting. The sniper said that we could just stay here and make a shelter. The rest of the teams looked at him, not understanding when he had gone crazy. But the military man repeated his offer without batting an eye. He didn't suggest giving up, quite the opposite. He suggested creating a safe zone for himself. The man had good skills in creating traps, and he offered his expert services. Despite the fact that he was still considered suspicious by others, no one except him believed in the successful implementation of this idea. Because in fact, only he in this world had the unique experience of a sniper and a spy. But for lack of options, I had to listen to the strange stranger who skillfully gave out orders. Amber dutifully dug the ground with a sapper's shovel while Henry made stakes. The pointed wooden sticks would not have been a mortal threat to the attackers, but they would have added to the inconvenience. In the forest, it was easy to camouflage something like this. It was enough to throw leaves from the trees growing around on top. The purpose of the appointed specialist was not to devise traps to defeat. The Templars were not supposed to die from the traps, but a large number of them were supposed to be injured. It was this category of fighters that irritated me the most in critical situations. There was no point in counting on the empathy of the High Priestess's apostates, but their ranks should have been significantly reduced. To increase the chances of such a future, it was necessary to deprive the monsters of mobility. Traps will prevent free movement in this area. The rest will be done by the team members. This approach by a foreigner was very different from the standard techniques known to the locals. In the midst of preparation, the White Rabbit finally woke up. Realizing that something interesting was happening, the sorcerer lit his way. The magic allowed us to safely pass by all the hidden recesses with stakes. When this part of the work was finished, Henry moved on to more complex mechanisms. He didn't ask anyone for help, and I managed to do it on my own pretty quickly. The man counted 16 traps that had been created, and he thought that would be enough to start with. Now the rest's task was only to lure the objects in the right direction. This part of the plan was much easier to handle. An hour later, Amber was already running in the pre-agreed direction. She was being pursued, and about a dozen Templars chose the girl as their target. She stopped only in the middle of the clearing. The wait was short. The first creature stepped into the trap within a few seconds. A brutal growl echoed through the forest. The giant lizard's paw was stuck pretty tightly in the stakes. She couldn't move, so Amber easily took the life of her opponent. The first success planted hope in my heart that everything would go better. The Templars themselves stopped in confusion, realizing that something had happened that was beyond their imagination. They moved cautiously across the lawn, but they still couldn't avoid damage. Amber didn't let the creatures regroup. She immediately attacked them and finished them off. Those of them who wanted to escape were also deprived of this chance. Eventually, all the lizards returned to the clearing, where death awaited them. A few minutes later, it was all over. All that was left was to wait for the results from Prince Leo. He, in turn, acted according to a similar scheme. He ran to the artificially created track, but did not even think of stopping. Quite the opposite. He picked up speed even more and jumped over the ravine. The Templars hung for a moment, analyzing the possible consequences for themselves. And the White Rabbit immediately took advantage of this. He directed the full force of his crushing spell at the villains. Those who managed to survive were not left without attention. The group did not need to wait for further enemy reinforcements. Amber came to the aid of her comrades and could not stand aside. The girl actually arrived at a rather opportune time. Another bloody mason has reached this place. He was about to pounce on his opponents, programmed to kill people. But a bullet in the forehead from Henry proved to be an insurmountable obstacle for the giant. He fell to the ground and showed no further signs of life. The prince could breathe easy. This time the danger had passed without losses. With the Templars' main weapon destroyed, the few survivors rushed to the attack. A trio of locals, led by a nobleman, decided to deal with these scumbags on their own. The fight was short-lived. With the help of magic and good old physical endurance, the comrades managed to win. The scoundrels were finished with this party. Fortunately, none of the Templars managed to escape, so reinforcements cannot be expected anytime soon. These eccentric fanatics sought only one thing: to fulfill their master's order. They, like zombies, were guided only by the desire to destroy the target. Since there were no more obstacles, the group had to move on. Throughout the entire route, they must choose a safe place and create traps around it. This tactic worked as long as opponents could not find out what had happened to their predecessors. Of course, unpredictable events could occur. What made things more difficult was that there were not enough people in the group to form an advanced detachment. But fortunately, the White Rabbit knew how to get around this inconvenience. He didn't want to constantly use magic that would significantly drain his body. At the same time, the sorcerer suggested using one of the blanks. She was quite effective. And, fortunately, it was not an artificial specimen. These leaves were supposed to indicate the route by which one could safely reach the desired place. They rose into the sky like little butterflies. Henry watched them go, spellbound, trying to remember the amazing sight. After activating the spells, the White Rabbit once again announced his desire to rest. In order not to torment his comrade, Prince Leo suggested making a stop somewhere nearby. They sat down under one of the large trees, not very close. Amber, checking the map, noted that at this rate they would reach the edge of the forest by dawn. This was good information, and everyone was happy about Henry's unexpected initiative in the process. The sensible comments on this matter completely confused the Special Forces officer, and he became embarrassed. But none of those present wanted to back down from their opinion. Their lives continued thanks to the sniper. Yes, one word led to another, and the conversation turned to the foreigner's armament. Prince Leo was very interested in observing the accuracy and degree of damage to the artifacts. He wanted to know more. Besides, Amber agreed that such destructive power was the best gift for them. In the context of the current situation, Henry himself believed that he apparently ended up here for a reason. The nobleman noted that it would be nice to continue the cooperation further. The sniper seemed to agree, but from his intonation, it was clear that there was some kind of but. The warrior suspected that such behavior was evidence of a desire to abandon them to their fate. But this was not at all the case. Henry was simply counting the cartridges very well. He already felt their shortage. Obviously, the locals did not understand what exactly was being discussed. That's why I had to demonstrate it to them visually. The specialist explained how exactly this little thing works, and that his work depends on it. The interlocutors realized that this was a significant problem, a milestone in their plan. All eyes in the group immediately turned to the White Rabbit, hoping that he could find a solution. To be honest, the sorcerer himself was very interested in the unknown object in Henry's hand. He wanted to take a closer look at the cartridge, and at the same time at the rifle itself. The sniper politely handed the artifact into his hands. The analysis progressed slowly, but no one rushed their colleague. Everyone silently awaited the verdict. Eventually, the White Rabbit gave the weapon back to its owner, and he announced that he had roughly understood how everything works. Amber was immediately delighted. She thought that this meant a quick solution to an unpleasant problem. But the interlocutor only shook his head thoughtfully. He had once seen documents in his mentor's laboratory describing a similar weapon. But the ingredients for this have not been used for a long time and have remained in the age of magic. It was completely unknown which attempt at magical justification would work. Moreover, the ashes were also freely available only in the imperial capital. But they had just escaped from it, and returning was completely impossible. The stifled silence, as before, was broken by Henry. He remembered the White Rabbit's ability to generate fire spheres. The locals called it flame magic, and the sniper thought it was similar to the way a rifle worked. The fire could not have come from anywhere. The sorcerer definitely generated it somehow. We must pay respect to the appointed specialist. He always thought outside the box. His theory made the White Rabbit think hard about unexpected options. Amber and Prince Leo waited humbly for the verdict. Suddenly the sorcerer's eyes widened, and he jumped up tensely in place. He was not sure that his calculations were correct. But not to try your theory would be a real crime. The idea was to develop magic balls, even though it would be difficult for the sand itself to reproduce the bullets. It will be possible to perform magical processing of this item. In addition to this, the White Rabbit decided to tackle the language problem. This happened just in time, when a new batch of enemies was already on the way. He created a kind of medallion that allowed Henry to freely understand the team members. This required immediate proximity, no further than 5 steps from the interlocutor. But, all the same, today, the appointed specialist held in his hand a very useful thing for himself. Back then, during intense combat, this little thing made the life of the military much easier. When he experienced magic on himself, he realized that its application to the balls would have an extraordinary result. In order to qualitatively change the small instrument of death, it was necessary to carry out engraving on the cartridge case. It will now contain a special magic formula. The spell must be applied to each ball in the remaining sniper's arsenal. While the details were being discussed among the group members, Henry watched them. From the behavior of all 3, it can be understood that they respect the abilities of the White Rabbit. The specialist wanted more, for example, modifications to the weapon itself, but was happy with what was available. This idea allowed the remaining balls to be reused many times without any worries. The sorcerer, meanwhile, asked not to disturb him for a while, because the process of creating such an invention requires concentration and painstaking work. While he was busy, the rest of the team acted according to a pre-planned scenario. Soon the Templars visited this lawn as well, provoking another fight. This time, the White Rabbit did not take part in repelling the attacks. Nobody insisted on this. It was important to hold out with the existing lineup until dawn. Luckily, the sun was supposed to rise quite soon. Although the attack of the connoisseurs of darkness gave unpleasant sensations and thoughts, the sorcerer had already made some progress. Not everything was perfect. He couldn't figure out what exactly was missing for activation. Theory and practice, as usual, diverged significantly. At the same time, Henry saved his ammunition as best he could. He calculated that his rifle should still be effective for 1 or 2 more attacks, after which he will have to switch to automatic. This means a fundamental change in combat strategy. Moreover, the damage from an automatic rifle was significantly different from that from a sniper rifle. All these discussions put incredible pressure on the White Rabbit. He felt the burden of responsibility. Only Leo's comments calmed him down. The prince was in favor of quality work. Bullets must work. No magical upgrade could cause an explosion inside a soldier's rifle. Another Templar invasion once again, after some time, occupied the team's attention. Weary, they still stood up to any attempts at their own destruction. At some point, the prince even breathed a sigh of relief that there were no bloody masons among the enemies. But this turned out to be premature joy, because, a moment later, one of them jumped out into the clearing. Somehow, the ugly giant found himself dangerously close to the White Rabbit. The sorcerer started to run, because no one could come to his aid. But everything ended well. The giant melted in the air, without ever carrying out his sinister plan. At first, no one understood what had happened, but it was about sunrise. Their salvation has come. Since the group was already close to the exit from the forest, they ran forward. A bright light was already visible through the trunks of the trees growing ahead. 2 minutes later, the 4 comrades in misfortune emerged onto a green lawn. Their joy knew no bounds. The terrible night seemed to be left only as a memory. But the first positive impression was soon replaced by anxiety. Smoke and the sound of many feet stamping appeared on the horizon. It was a whole horde of Templars, along with bloody masons. The army moved straight towards the people. Henry exhaled tensely, his rifle cartridges having run out in the forest. There was nowhere to run, and everyone understood this perfectly well. The battle was inevitably approaching, so in order to be useful to the team, the sniper decided to use a machine gun. And although there were few cartridges, this should at least somehow relieve the rest of the soldiers. Once they are over, you can start from the circumstances. Suddenly, Henry's thoughts were interrupted by the appearance of a white rabbit nearby. The sorcerer held in his hands an enchanted rifle cartridge. Probably, the specialist has never been so happy about something as he is now. Although the magician did not guarantee a positive result, his work was still better than nothing at all. The sniper decided to immediately try out the innovations in practice. He wasn't afraid of the consequences. He had nothing to lose anyway. The man loaded his rifle and prepared to take a comfortable position. As the horde ran towards the group with all their might, with the intention of, Henry announced that he would enter the thicket and fight from there. Amber thought that the man was trying to sit it out because he was avoiding a direct confrontation. But the sniper rightly noted that in this way he could pave the way for the team. Prince Leo remained thoughtfully silent. He couldn't help but agree that the newcomer had some good ideas. Of the whole company, the White Rabbit remained the most nervous, especially when I saw something a little horrible in the crowd. Later, Henry was able to see what was being discussed. Between the Templar troops walked ordinary people, as far as it could be called normal, because they looked creepy. Most likely, the eccentrics were part of a cohort of religious fanatics. But even here, everything was not so simple. The White Rabbit reported that the locals called such individuals gua. There was no more time to talk because the opponents were very close. So the educational lecture for Henry had to be postponed. The specialist ran to a tall tree at the edge of the clearing. He got into a comfortable position and looked through the rifle's scope. He easily found his first target. Bloody Mason was walking surrounded by zombified people. Only now, at this moment, did Henry suddenly realize that he still had not known the reasons for this persecution. Having assessed the situation, the sniper gave the order to the group to move forward. It was necessary to attack first, and everything would be fine if the specialist himself were not left behind, alone. But judging by the man's response to the comments of others, such features did not bother him at all. Prince Leo stopped chatting and ordered everyone to stick to the plan. The comrades moved forward. The crowd moved in an impromptu pig formation, intending to divide or quickly surround the small detachment. The first clashes began within moments. The trio of warriors fought fiercely. Their lives depended on it. Even the White Rabbit used all the magic he had, sparing no effort. Everything was going pretty well until one incident occurred. The prince froze in place when he saw one of his subjects standing in front of him. He couldn't fight against an ordinary woman, even though she was a gua. The man froze in place, unable to move. Suddenly, the opponent's face turned into a hellish physique. She rushed forward, screaming. Only Henry's reaction saved Leo. The sniper shot the woman in the forehead. The prince was overcome with sadness at what he saw. The nobleman was brought back to consciousness only by the voice of Amber, who insisted on active action. The girl ran up and started fighting nearby. She emphasized that there were no ordinary people among this crowd. Another Templar ran out of regular ammo. The soldier clenched his teeth tensely. Now all that remains is to try out the White Rabbit's invention. Having inserted a magazine into the rifle, the man prepared to take aim. Now he could rely only on his faith, although he had not previously been distinguished by this ability. He couldn't let his new acquaintances down, especially since they were already losing strength. The sorcerer suddenly stopped fighting and blood began to flow from his mouth. Amber looked around in fear, despite the fact that she herself was surrounded by villains. The prince came to the woman's aid and covered her rear. The plan had to be changed. The rabbit could not clear the way. This duty was taken on by the warrior. Just as Henry had already chosen his target and was preparing to pull the trigger, something happened. A horn sounded on the horizon. He announced the arrival of reinforcements. Fortunately, help came for people. The flags held by the knights had a characteristic design. It was Count Leroy, known to everyone in this world. He heard about the prince's adventures in the local lands and hastened to meet him. The holy blood had to be protected at the cost of one's life. Leroy's subordinates rushed into the attack without hesitation, pursuing the goal of destroying the traitors. The Count himself also did not stand aside. The assistance turned out to be quite productive. The availability of horses among the new arrivals also ensured rapid advancement. The Templars were angry. They did not expect that anyone would stand up for the fugitive who was in an unknown location. Prince Leo watched with joy as his pursuers lost. Leroy, who appeared in front of him on horseback, greeted him respectfully. It seemed like they hadn't seen each other for ages. Fortunately, the nobleman did not suffer a single scratch during his difficult journey. He politely thanked her for saving him. With just one glance, the Count ordered one of his subordinates to bring the master a horse. He in turn quickly jumped into the saddle. Having received the weapon from the hands of his old comrade, Leo finally caught his breath a little. Now it was possible to fight with a long-forgotten advantage. It was good to have friends. A moment later, the prince was riding his horse across the field and cutting off the heads of the Templars. The small wandering band, reinforced by knights, gradually began to win. They all acted as a single organism. Even the White Rabbit got something like a second wind. Not to mention Amber, who was still tensely tracking the Lord's route. Henry was genuinely happy about such events. People managed to turn the situation in their favor at a convenient time. Therefore, the appointed specialist did not intend to stop there. He found in his sights another giant rushing to fight. The man pulled the trigger with bated breath. A shot rang out. The magic spell on the cartridge case worked as it should. The cartridge actually became multiple. Instead of itself, it released a source of deadly energy into the world, and he, in turn, got to the victim in a matter of seconds. Crooked Mason had no chance of survival. He got a bullet in the head and began to stagger. Luckily, the monster fell on the Templars who were behind it. Henry smiled with pleasure. This upgrade changed everything. The husband reloaded his rifle out of habit and began searching for a new target. Meanwhile, Leroy was at the forefront of a new counterattack. The Count, together with his men, rushed into the very thick of the monsters. When the next traitors were dealt with, Bloody Mason suddenly appeared before the knight. Leroy prepared for another fight, but the giant fell, struck in the head by an unknown force. Confused, the warrior began to look around, trying to find the source of such power. In the distance, on the horizon, almost at the top of the tree, he saw a strange reflection of light. To be honest, Leroy didn't know what to do. But Prince Leo, who appeared nearby, explained that there was no need to pay attention to whoever was there. He was one of our own. One could even say a good friend. This remark made the Count even more curious about who was hiding there. But it was time for the battle to end, so the man focused on more pressing matters. He ordered his men to go on a new offensive. Others joined in the process with no less zeal. They saw what they had already achieved and knew that they could defeat their opponents to the end. All that was left was to hold out for a little while. Moreover, panic has already begun to form among the ranks of traitors. Fortunately, the evil supporters were dealt with quite quickly. Some were even captured. The only thing Prince Leo regretted was that his subordinates, transformed into Gua, suffered after death. Despite Henry's hope, there was nothing that could be done about it. Only the Archmage had the power to reverse such a powerful spell. This man was the teacher of the White Rabbit, and it was in his power to remove the curse of evil spirits. The sorcerer agreed with Ember's statements. He believed in his mentor. But they still wouldn't have been able to reach his abode at a convenient time. When a person is under such a curse, there are only 10 days left to reverse it. Having learned about the nuances, the sniper was confused. He did not understand why he was dragging the damned souls along with him. The answer was simple. The prince could not abandon his people to their fate. It was a kind of act of respect and mercy on the part of the ruler. Soon, a scout was already racing towards the column at full speed. He reported that the nearest castle was 30 kilometers away, but there was still a small village on the way. Now it was necessary to decide what exactly to do. Although they were traveling on horses, it was impossible to quickly cover the road. Among those gathered, prisoners who were moving on foot were also wounded. Count Leroy suggested spending the night in the village so that his people could recover. The prince did not object to this, and Henry, in turn, was not surprised. Within a few hours, the frightened peasants were watching the formidable warriors who had disturbed their peace. Luckily, they didn't identify the threat. The visitors needed shelter. At the local tavern, for the first time that Sunday, Henry was able to have a proper meal. It's time for sincere conversations on a full stomach. The prince thanked the knight with all his heart for his help, and he, in turn, hastened to remind him that sacrificing his life to save Leo was his duty. When it was time for serious meetings, the foreigner was, of course, asked to leave. The specialist stood up silently. He walked towards the door without looking back once. The man understood this attitude towards himself very well. He was a stranger here, and they did not trust him. Amber, who was hurrying to catch up with the military man, was worried that he was offended. But this was absolutely not the case. The sniper understood the full value of secret data, but he did not claim to have their knowledge. This position seemed suspicious to the woman. The interlocutor always remained too cold-blooded. And although he pretended not to understand what was being discussed, the warrior's memory still lingered with memories of recent events, decisive actions of unconventional solutions, unexpected plans that no one believed in at first. But the unrivaled result changed everything. It was a practical experience of fighting that this world had never known. So it was very stressful for Amber to realize that there were many such specialists where Henry came from. From the silence that unexpectedly formed in the dialogue, the specialist immediately realized that the wind had changed. He knew it was time to tell more about South Korea. The sniper reported that about 50 million people live in the country. This news made the woman's heart even more constricted with anxiety. And when the interlocutor began to list the military contingent in the smallest detail, she completely exploded. It was perceived as something impossible. 500,000 fighting men who had the same experience as Henry were a potential threat. In addition, that world was not limited to one country. Neighboring states also had their own arsenal and armies. Watching the panic growing on Amber's face, the sniper hastened to calm her down. They had nothing to fear because he had come here by accident, and their worlds had not intersected in any way. On the contrary, the man wanted to return home, but simply did not know how to do it. The warrior thought, but after a few seconds she said that she would not abandon her comrade in trouble, just as he did not abandon them. Although she personally could not help in returning, there was still hope. This news immediately lifted the special agent's spirits. The White Rabbit, whose real name was Lou, by the way, might have known something about this. And if he couldn't cope, he could always ask the Archmage, his teacher, for guidance. This man was considered the wisest on the continent, and most likely had the power to open the portal. So, in just 2 minutes, a plan for how to get to the capital was formed in the woman's head. After all, it was there that the main residence of this respected person was located. But at the same time, inside the tavern, Prince Leo learned bad news. The Count reported that about 10 palaces on the way to the capital were captured by the rebels. With others, however, it was impossible to maintain contact. So this could mean the worst. Although no conscious person wanted this under any circumstances, the capital could already be under the control of restless sectarians. While the prince was getting the news in the small village, in the heart of the country, they knew very well what he was doing. The meeting with Count Leroy and the destruction of the Templar army did not go unnoticed. The only thing that didn't fit into the usual scenario was the help of an unknown person who worked from a distance the whole time. Although on the one hand it was worrying, on the other hand, the game thus became more and more interesting. Together with the exiled Count, who managed to escape the massacre, they created an effective tandem. Everyone except the priestess was suspicious of Prince Leo's advancement. Because the woman did not show any negativity, her subordinates were interested in her future plans. It was necessary to properly teach the impudent nobleman a lesson so that he would not even think of going to the capital. This suggested a carefully planned ambush along the way. For this, the cunning beast was ready to use a special bait. She was sure that in that case, Leo would not be able to pass by. Tens of kilometers from the palace, Henry was completely at a loss. Amber's words hit him right in the heart. The woman said her greatest desire, to get home, could be quite achievable. He was ready to do anything to get his old life back. As it turned out, Magicians were considered a separate race here, and not a very friendly one at that. They were difficult to negotiate with because of their incomprehensible arrogance and thirst. As a rule, all sorcerers were loners, in some places even hermits. Henry was well acquainted with the terms Amber used to describe this contingent. He fully understood the fanaticism and desire for new discoveries, the development of professionalism. All this required money, and not ordinary money. The White Rabbit, Lou, received support from the government and was therefore considered to have a fairly warm character. He was willing to help Henry meet his cherished dream halfway. While talking, the comrades approached the tent that was allocated to the group. There was a sorcerer inside, and at first glance it was clear that things were bad for him. Even Amber's positive attitude didn't improve the situation. It turned out that there were good reasons for concern. For several hours now, the White Rabbit has been unable to establish contact with the Tower of Magicians. There were definitely some problems in the capital because such options could not just disappear. The only thing that could prevent the restoration of communication with other sorcerers was an important reason or death. Something had definitely happened in the heart of the country, and even Henry could tell. He understood that these were military conflicts and state conspiracies. The anxious silence was broken by the appearance of one of the knights. It turns out he was looking for all three. The man was carrying out an order from Prince Leo, who wanted to see his comrades immediately. A few minutes later, the entire team gathered around the table. They saw the possible capture of the capital. And of course, the first reaction was distrust. No one wanted to allow this to happen, especially in the context of Lou's news. Leo hoped that at least the Archmage had managed to escape capture. Otherwise, there would be almost no strong representatives left on the side of good. Of course, this was the work of religious fanatics who were under the control of the Templars. To finally confirm his suspicions, the prince suggested sending someone on reconnaissance. The White Rabbit immediately offered his candidacy for this role, despite objections. He couldn't just sit and wait for someone to report. His teacher was in danger. Another messenger burst into the room with urgent news. The Count turned around and looked at the newcomer. As it turned out, somewhere near the village, the Templars were pursuing some knight. Judging by the armor he was wearing, he belonged to the Emperor's own guard. From Prince Leo's point of view, this was an extraordinary character. Because of this man, one could find out what was happening in the capital now. He wanted to help the stranger avoid trouble. Leroy immediately jumped up from his seat and ordered that the victim be rescued immediately. Henry knew things were really bad. Now the way to the capital was most likely closed. The only hope left was that the Supreme Mage had managed to survive. Because if this were not so, the soldier would never be able to return home. While the Count was giving orders and getting ready to set off, the prince wanted to join the search party. He realized that it could be a trap only when his interlocutor said so. And then, having thought everything over in detail, he calmed down. Amber just gnashed her teeth in anger. She didn't understand at all how all this could have happened. No one present, frankly speaking, could have imagined that the imperial reign could end like this. Leo's family may have been in trouble as well, but the noblemen believed that they could cope. Henry did not engage in open dialogue with those gathered. He preferred to stay away and observe. The specialist understood that he had entered this world at an extremely difficult time for him. The situation was further complicated by the lack of any kind of connection between the individual cities and villages of this country. Amber didn't let me remain unnoticed in this war room. The woman was interested in the sniper's opinion about this amazing knight who needed to be saved. They were a great distance from the capital, so he allegedly covered the distance without stopping, considering that many enemies were waiting for him on the way. To be honest, Henry suspected that this was some kind of another trap by the enemies, a kind of Trojan horse. If you look at the situation from the outside, this is the first thing that comes to mind. But it was still possible to replay. This did not mean open confrontation from the first seconds. It was possible to take advantage of the circumstances and pull the blanket over oneself. The strategy in this case could decide everything. The specialist came up with several options for the search party's behavior. He advocated using any available methods to make life difficult for the enemy. The prince let the military man's comments pass through his mind, thinking hard. And so, just a few hours later, a search party led by the Count found the fugitive. He walked on foot in complete darkness. Leroy silently looked at the strange, at first glance, exhausted man. And he, in turn, did the same. He was the first to break the silence, falling to one knee and solemnly congratulating his savior. The stranger's name was Kurt Rias. He was the son of the knight Norman Rias, a comrade of the Count. According to the fugitive, his father took care of the safety of the prince and princess during their escape from the capital. This news helped to lift Leroy's spirits. It turns out that the prince was right. Now, according to the interlocutor, it turned out that the imperial family was safe. But this was also relative because the Rahoman fortress to which they went was surrounded. Already in the village, first of all, the new arrival met Leo. The husband immediately threw himself at the nobleman's feet, prostrating himself in high-flown phrases. In turn, the prince thanked his family members for saving them, considering it a noble act. Once the rescued man was sent to his room for the night, it was time for discussion. No one present was sure that Kurt was telling the real truth. The comrades were inclined to believe that someone was directing them and trying to lure Prince Leo out. There was no way to avoid a catch, given the difficulties that lay in wait around. But on the other hand, it was impossible to ignore information about the entourage of the members of the imperial family. It was necessary to save them, but to act with caution. Detailed development of an action plan began. The next morning, when the sun had just appeared on the horizon, the knights were already ready for the campaign. Leroy gave a motivational speech, first of all, without forcing anyone to join him. But every single one of his subordinates remained in the ranks. They respected their commander. The prince, having thought it over carefully during the night, decided not to stand aside. He took part in the rescue operation together with his comrades. The Rahoman fortress was indeed surrounded by the Empire's enemies. They were preparing for assault actions, but in reality, they were in no hurry, which gave the opportunity for the Knights Defenders of the imperial family to prepare for defense. As far as possible, the warriors put their armor in order and looked for additional equipment. Prince Leo's sister, Deborah, watched the events outside the fortress walls with alarm. It was clear to everyone that this night could be decisive and evil would prevail. The princess placed all her hopes on Kurt, who had set out at the beginning to search for Count Leroy. Norman Rias followed the woman closely, insisting that she leave this dangerous place. But Deborah remained adamant. She did not want to abandon her loyal people to their fate, despite the fact that this was already the fourth day of continuous siege of the Rahoman fortress. During this time, all the survivors were extremely exhausted and holding on to their last strength. Only inside, somewhere very deep, there still glimmered hope for possible reinforcements. In any case, no one could escape fate. Adults have always made decisions for themselves, unlike children. The greatest worry in Norman's mind was the life of the little prince, Marcus. The boy was currently in relative safety, which depended on the integrity of the fortress wall. Now he was suffering for practically nothing, and Norman Rias wanted more in this chaos to save the young soul from death and abuse. The uncertainty put pressure on everyone inside the besieged city. The boy's guard tried to remain brave and not show him any concern or fear. He wanted Marcus to not have to worry about the serious problems lurking outside for as long as possible. The whole day was spent in preparation, and now the scorching sun has finally hidden behind the horizon. Torches were lit throughout the fortress. The defenders lined up on the walls, ready to repel any danger. There was silence, and the leaves could be heard swaying on the trees. Deborah decided to stay with the rest of the warriors until the last. Norman, who always stood by her side, gave the order to prepare. The offensive was about to begin. Sometimes it seemed as if he had the gift of foresight, for immediately after these words, enemy arrows rose into the air. The warriors tried to protect themselves from them with shields and warned those below. Of course, there were casualties. The first volley of fiery murder weapons pierced the bodies of many knights. But, in addition, he set fire to the equipment at the bottom of the fortress, along with several buildings. It was necessary to extinguish the flames, which is what the defenders did. Meanwhile, the enemies were already preparing to use catapults. With the help of the bloody masons, the first giant stones flew into the sky. There was no defense against such attacks at all. All that was left was to dodge. Seeing the confusion among the ranks of the imperial family's defenders, the rebel apostates ran forward to consolidate their victory. They threw long ladders onto the wall, but they took advantage of the fact that the knights fled from their positions. Norman tried to motivate the defenders to continue to defend the fortress. He showed how to act by his own example. As it turned out, this was ineffective, so after just a quarter of an hour, panic arose in the fortress palace. Through the windows of the building, one could see dozens, if not hundreds, of fiery shells flying toward the city. There was a real panic among Rahoman's guards. Norman tried to persuade the princess to save her life. Her Highness needed to evacuate immediately along with Marcus. Although the gates had not yet been broken through, there was very little time left before that happened. No matter how much the knight tried to persuade Debord to come down from the wall, the girl always refused. She worried about her people and the locals, and she didn't think that now was not the time for their life, and that she was more important than others. The princess categorically rejected any suggestions to leave the fortress. Quite the opposite. She got her weapon. Her Highness rushed forward, ready to meet the enemy in full armor. Together with the knights who immediately stood around her, she motivated the others to guard Rahoman until the end. Within a few seconds, the gates were finally breached, and the first bloody mason burst inside. He threw people around him like bowling pins. The ordinary citizens who joined the defense had no chance against him. Deborah understood that the fortress was in bad shape, and that this story would probably not end well. Suddenly, the sound of a horn, heard on the other side of the wall, gave hope to all the defenders. The long-awaited reinforcements have arrived. Now the course of this furious multi-day standoff could change. The princess rushed back to the wall to see if her ears had failed her, but everything was as she had hoped. On the horizon, the whole sky was covered in dust from the multitude of horsemen. It was the same Count Leroy that Kurt Rias had set out to find. Now all that remained was to inform everyone else of the turning point. The knights greeted this news with wild enthusiasm. Meanwhile, the Count flew at maximum speed, reducing the distance between the army and the enemy. The first attackers soon learned the sharpness of his sword. Within the walls of the fortress, no one was going to relax either. Those who broke through had to be eliminated. Among the new arrivals, Kurt himself could already be seen. The husband was fiercely fighting with his opponents. Very soon, he passed through the gate and began to look for his father. He was on the wall and happily called his son. During the meeting with the princess, the guard bowed respectfully, glad that she managed to survive. But just in the middle of a conversation, everything could change, and not for the better. Somehow, one of the enemies got onto the wall and intended to eliminate Her Highness. He vilely attacked the girl from behind, about which Norman managed to warn her. Deborah looked back. She had no time to repel the insidious attack. But a sniper came to the woman's aid, and with one shot, Henry took the killer's life. The shocked princess looked in the direction from which the shot came. It was obvious that in their crowd, it was impossible to understand who exactly saved her. But the appointed specialist could rely on a new acquaintance with an influential person after the battle. The reinforcements arrived at a convenient time, and it seemed that the rebels did not expect such pressure. All members of Count Leroy's squad acted as a single organism. The opponents could not resist the extreme magical power of the White Rabbit. With Ember's skills, even the Bloody Masons had a hard time keeping up. The siege was finally lifted within a few hours. The surviving enemies admitted their defeat, while the rest awaited burial. Deborah was incredibly happy that all the hopes of the fortress defenders had come true, and they, in turn, were already eager to celebrate the victory. The princess did not yet understand that she might meet her brother in the crowd of new arrivals. A few minutes later, the members of the imperial family united and went to visit little Marcus. The boy jumped out of the room as soon as he heard Leo's voice outside the door. The tired security guard, who had spent all his time with the kids in the room, could no longer keep up with the speed of the young legs. Two brothers who had not seen each other for too long got the chance to hug today. Until that moment, Leo had no idea how much he missed the warmth of family. Deborah looked at the picture from the side, unable to hide her smile, as did Henry. After warm hugs and heartfelt conversations, it's time to get together for a meeting. Norman was sure that this battle for the fortress was not decisive. Of course, Leroy's arrival pushed back the enemies, but it did not deprive them of their desire to destroy the imperial family. Besides, now even Prince Leo has joined the defenders of Rahomen. This meant that all the eggs were now in one basket, and the situation was getting worse. Henry did not interfere in the discourse, but analyzed everything. They were not able to maintain this structure indefinitely. It is obvious that the enemies will decide to double the number and troops for the subsequent siege. While there was a temporary lull, local residents gratefully brought prepared food to the palace. They wanted to somehow thank their saviors, and the princess, in turn, thanked everyone for their kindness. Henry, watching what was happening from the window, understood that no one could abandon these people. The imperial family was too warm-hearted and noble for such actions, and Leo, as if confirming his thoughts, began to look out loud for other options. There were already not enough supplies for everyone to defend themselves. There is no need to imagine what will happen to the residents after a long siege. The pressure will only increase, so a second attack on the city could be fatal. It wasn't just about food. Amber was the first to talk about the lack of weapons. Leo didn't intend to create any illusions. He just wanted to choose the best option for everyone. Norman resorted to any effective measures, even collecting weapons outside the fortress on the battlefield. The meeting finally reached an impasse, from which Henry again pointed out a possible way out. He suggested not to wait for the next siege, but to attack first, despite fatigue. Of course, such a proposal could have caused resistance and protest among the soldiers. But not trusting the sniper's opinion has recently become something impossible for Prince Leo. This soldier has already saved his life, and that of his loved ones more than once. But he has already earned a reputation as a man to be listened to. The Special Forces soldier insisted that not only were the defenders tired, but the enemy too. Moreover, the scoundrels were suppressed by their recent defeat. In the event of a surprise attack, there was a chance to completely break the freedom of the rebels. This strange idea interested those gathered, and the prince insisted on a detailed discussion of the nuances. In fact, Henry's plan was surprisingly simple. It was built on the German army's wedge tactic. It was necessary to divide the enemy army into two parts and form a kind of cauldron. This will create a so-called blitzkrieg and will make the situation much more difficult for the rebels. Apparently, no one present knew the meaning of this word, so the specialist had to explain. This breakthrough into the enemy camp must be unexpected and quick. And now is the right time for such actions, because none of the opponents are fully expecting it. Everyone wants to take a break from what they've experienced and recuperate, especially the rebels, who still feel they have a numerical advantage. The sniper used various historical terms from World War II in his story. The Soviet Union and the Third Reich. These names meant nothing to those present. Since Henry was fascinated by history, it was easy to identify his actions with the past. He literally divided all the current wealthy defenders into groups and assigned each one a separate task. The knights only had to think it over properly and agree to it or not. Those who saw the sniper for the first time were wary of his statements. But the Prince Viceroy brought him with him, and the military man was worthy of attention. After some thought, Leroy asked if the speaker himself was confident in his plan, and he answered thoroughly that, despite his little experience of living in this world, I have already managed to understand a lot, especially regarding the rebels. Even in the story about the history of the Second World War, the listeners were very interested in the riddle about the armored personnel carriers. Henry outlined all the features of the heavy equipment, and to his interlocutors, it sounded futuristic. And the White Rabbit beamed with inspiration. He already wanted to start working on a similar invention. In the end, Leroy agreed with the correctness of the specialist appointee's plan. It was a good chance. Any clash with the enemy meant great risks, and an offensive increased them even more. But, to get a result that would satisfy everyone who was in the fortress, it was necessary to cast aside doubts and put their destinies on the line for victory. Leo agreed to the offensive, but noted that he needed the Count's protection. When the meeting was over, Norman was finally able to talk to his comrade. He was interested in why everyone around him, even the prince, listened to a man who was unknown to anyone. Moreover, he proposed an extremely complex and dangerous operation. Realizing that his interlocutor's uncertainty could affect the rest of the troops, Leroy interrupted him. He did not want doubts about the decisions of the imperial family to incite the people. In such a difficult time, it was necessary to reject unnecessary doubts and trust the owner. Even the most dangerous strategy could sometimes save thousands of lives. After listening to the Count's opinion, Norman realized the primitivism of his thinking and respectfully retreated. The husband vowed to do everything possible to ensure that Henry's plan would succeed. When all matters were settled, the brother was finally able to meet with his sister in private. Both could not sleep because of thoughts about tomorrow. They had not seen each other for only 2 months, but the feeling spoke of a separation for years. The last good memory was Deborah's birthday. Now they were also together, but circumstances changed their lives radically. Everything around, at first glance, remained the same, but everything changed at once. Leo was curious about what fate befell his other relatives. He had heard about his father and mother. Everything seemed to be fine with them, but the fate of other relatives and acquaintances was probably disappointing. The memories were too painful for the princess. She saw with her own eyes the bloody carnage that had been unleashed, the rebels in the palace and the capital as a whole. There are many traitors among the emperor's personal guard. They opened the gates with their own hands and let the bloody masons in. Resistance was completely impossible. We had to flee quickly, leaving the people to their fate. While telling all these terrible events, the sister could not resist, and, with tears, pressed herself to her brother's chest. At dawn, the Rahoman fortress was already preparing to advance into enemy territory. The knights lined up in ranks, ready to leave the outpost, which remained impregnable. Leroy ordered the condition of all city gates to be checked. There was a short roll call. The report was not long in coming. Everything worked as it should. When the prince received the last report, he gave the signal to the army from the wall at the central gate. It was picked up by other coordinators, after which each of the gates of the Rahoman fortress began to open. The knights split into groups and went outside the city, ready to fight for survival. They managed to advance so unnoticed and quietly that their enemies saw them too late for themselves. This came as a complete surprise to the villains. The commander-in-chief could not believe his eyes when he came out of his tent. The imperial family's troops were not just advancing, they were already fighting on the camp's territory. The confused rebels did not know what to do. They were frozen, unarmed, and sleepy. Now, Bishop Isabel's men regretted that they had not foreseen all the treachery of the enemy. Leroy commanded the army from the fortress. This was agreed upon in advance. On his orders, archers signaled to each of the detachments about the beginning of certain offensive actions. Each group had to cut off its piece from the rebel army. By isolating the sectarians in mini cauldrons in this way, it was much easier and faster to deal with them. The commander-in-chief of the enemy army could not withstand such pressure and lost consciousness. The actions of the imperial army and the lack of cool heads among the senior officers sowed panic among the soldiers. It looked like a real child abuse, and not a battle on equal terms with the scoundrels who spent 5 days besieging the Rahoman fortress. Everything in the enemy camp was burning: tents, equipment, and monsters. Leo watched the progress of the operation and noted with relief that there had been no problems so far. The whole operation was built on the outstanding minds of his new acquaintance. It was Henry who came up with the idea of how best to communicate with all parts of the Empire's army. This did not require bringing the commander-in-chief onto the battlefield. There was simply no point in doing so. The specialist's idea was to use light signals. These could have been torches, flaming arrows, or something else. A large number of mages could come in handy. But for this, everyone had to have the ability to control flame, which no one had done before. More logical, in the sniper's opinion, was the creation of a flash and noise bomb. And according to the plan, it was now that the main shot was supposed to happen. Leroy looked towards Henry. Now it was the sniper's turn to get to work. At the request of a military man, a cartridge was created that would work like a flash and noise grenade. The sorcerer approached this task with zeal. He liked challenges. The result exceeded all expectations. After the shot, a kind of sun formed over the fortress, illuminating everything around. It was this shot that served as the signal at the beginning of the division of the enemy. All units simultaneously surrounded the opponents and isolated them from each other. The villains had no other option to escape. They accepted death, some with weapons in their hands, and some without. The Bloody Masons could do nothing against such an unexpected invasion. Under the improvised sun, everyone who was planning to run away or was planning something insidious was visible. The giant monsters were helpless when they did not receive clear instructions. Amber took advantage of this advantage very well. The woman mercilessly mowed down the ranks of the Empire's traitors. The warrior was very categorical. She did not want to take prisoners and showed it with her whole appearance. The opponents were forced to flee to save their lives. If this, of course, seemed possible, and their agility allowed them to survive at the expense of their other comrades, Norman ordered that no one be lost in the chaos. Good lighting made it easier to fight. Every member of every detachment did everything in his power to ensure the success of the operation. The White Rabbit led a squad of sorcerers who wielded flame magic. They assisted the military who attacked under the auspices of Prince Leo. Every man was an integral cog in a carefully planned blitzkrieg. Henry watched closely the results of the advance into the enemy camp. Half an hour later, he informed Lara that the potential worst stage had already been passed. All that remained was to finish as quickly as possible what had started out of the blue for the opponents. In order to survive, some of the rebel worker bees decided to shrewdly surrender. This contributed to the rapid completion of the operation, and the soldiers celebrated their victory. Leroy, who had come down from the wall, thanked the prince for his participation. He understood that everything had been completed successfully, thanks to the efforts of his team. Especially thanks to Henry, the strange soldier from another world who was now standing next to Deborah. The specialist quite rightly deserved to be treated with less respect, and Lara finally had to admit it. Now doubts about the sniper's treacherous nature should disappear. The sun rose over the fortress, which could already breathe freely and deeply. Prince Leo announced that after resting they had to set out on their journey. Norman tried to object in response, despite Leroy's comments to himself. The man feared that bleeding this fortress dry would have fatal consequences. They could be attacked by enemies on the way, and there was no protection in open areas. Despite all the dangers, sitting still, in the Count's opinion, was a bad option. It was necessary to fight, as Prince Leo insisted. Moreover, local residents were already on the brink of survival. The nobleman was not afraid of any kind of rebellion or uprising from within. The problem was the lack of supplies, people had nothing to eat, and the army inside was taking all the resources for itself. At night, through the quiet corridors of the palace, the princess tried to get to a safe place. She found an empty room suitable for secret negotiations and stopped there. The magical communication sphere under her cloak quickly activated. The girl had to warn about the plans. As part of Count Leroy's detachment, they set out to cross the Web Mountains. There, on the Allies' estate, another trap could be set. The princess was glad that she had been able to keep her membership in the rebel camp a secret until now. Although it was a very difficult task, by morning the Rahoman fortress opened its central gate. People came out to see the Prince Viceroy and his army out of the city. Along with the nobleman rode Leroy. He gave orders to the rest of the troops. They silently left the buildings that served as their shelter, trying not to look back. Marcus, who was riding in the carriage with his sister and a guard at the back, looked out the window with interest. For the first time, he had the opportunity to see the foreign military man that everyone was talking about. The warrior from another world excited the boy's young, inspired imagination. But Deborah, looking at the sniper's back, saw only potential problems. The whole plan could have gone down the drain through one person. Almost a whole day had passed on the road, and so far all progress seemed calm. None of the military saw any signs of pursuit, and local civilians could feel safe. The princess, pretending not to know about her own plan, engaged in small talk with her bodyguard. He, of course, not suspecting anything, thought that the danger was far behind. The woman did not give herself away in any way, and in general, could one have imagined that a member of the imperial family would become a traitor? As the sun began to set over the horizon, the scouts saw a forest ahead. This served as a signal for a halt. It was impossible to enter such an area without careful preparation. Leroy gave the order to set up camp in the open air. The subordinates, accustomed to extreme conditions, immediately rushed to carry out the order. When it was completely dark around, The Count, Norman, Kurt, and Prince Leo's usual squad gathered for a meeting. Further action needed to be discussed. Deborah's security chief still didn't trust the otherworldly eccentric and treated him with caution. Leroy, who was sitting next to him, in turn suspected everyone who was in the fortress. No one yet knew for sure who among those present was playing a double game. It was incredibly annoying and made me behave carefully. Everyone present around the fire was sure that a trap was waiting for them somewhere ahead. The absence of a chase was a clear confirmation of this. Back in the fortress, with the participation of the same team, a plan for moving forward was discussed in detail. But while some of the team began to have doubts, Henry had to call them to rationality. There was simply no other choice. If something had already been agreed upon, it was necessary to act. All that remained was to hope that the spy hunting the princess and the little prince would expose himself. The tricky spy games were annoying in their complexity, but victory by any means has always been practiced in all wars. So the specialist did not consider this to be anything extraordinary. Captured members of the imperial family were a good trump card. The main thing for the group is to catch the traitor before reaching the final destination. The forest ahead should have helped a lot with this. When the sun began to glow above the sky, the motorcade got ready to set off. But this time, the soldiers were not going to ride together. The scouts were supposed to go ahead. Moreover, several groups at once. They had to pave the way for others to follow, for those who were following behind and transporting civilians. Soon the first knights entered the dense thicket. The White Rabbit moved next to Ember. He doubted that there was a trap ahead. But the woman had already become accustomed to trusting Henry's premonitions and did not doubt his decisions. Even though this plan could have killed people, all the same, thanks to the scout detachments, the main army will be able to survive and reach its destination. Thanks to the system of signals that each of the pioneer groups will give, it will be possible to build a wonderful green route for everyone else. One could only hope that the opponents would not act in the same way. But if this happens, it will be clear that the spy is someone present at yesterday's fire. For now, we needed to trust each other and get through the forest location as quickly as possible. A green light came on ahead, meaning the way was clear. The motorcade at the back split up to follow each of the scout groups. The game of survival has begun. Gradually, parts of the Imperial Army moved forward. The knights faithfully fulfilled their obligations and announced the route, which remained green. But soon, everything changed. A red rocket rose into the sky. So, as Henry had suspected, there was a trap ahead. No one knew who exactly was in ambush, so they had to prepare for the worst. The situation really did seem quite difficult. The detachment that was carrying out reconnaissance was suddenly attacked. No one noticed the enemies. The first monster jumped out to meet the people. He immediately killed several of the imperial family's bodyguards. The rest immediately dispersed so as not to become easy prey. Some joined the fight, while other men on smart horses continued to advance, informing the others. They tried to launch the rocket upward, hoping that the danger had passed. But the performer failed to do this. The tail of another monster cut off his head. Among those present was a traitor who did not even try to hide it. He galloped forward as 3 monsters flew at his fellows, aiming to tear them to shreds. There was an urgent need to send a signal. But he who betrayed his comrades was also not supposed to leave the battlefield unharmed. The spear pierced his body through and through, leaving no chance for survival. It was not one of the squad members who did this, but an unknown secret killer who came to the people's aid. With the help of 3 other pikes, he dealt with the monsters that blocked the way forward. Without revealing his face to others, the man allowed them to remain alive. As the last survivor left the lawn, a red rocket lit up the sky. It was the same danger signal that the others saw. The identity of the stranger was known only to a select few, for those who were going to the meeting. It was Kurt, who Henry had put in charge of the covert operation. That night, such a proposal took many by surprise. At the suggestion of a specialist, Norman's son was to form a group for quiet and unnoticeable operations. Moreover, Kurt had to independently find individuals worthy of this position. Now, as more and more red signals appeared in the sky, the scout's father was worried about his son, and even more, for the fate of the mission. Before dawn, the chief spy of the Imperial Army returned to Leo's tent. He had some bad news. While searching for worthy candidates, he came up against harsh reality. There were many traitors among the troops, and they all knew the route of movement. It was both overwhelming and outrageous. Norman, unable to bear such shame, immediately wanted to deal with the rebels. But Kurt stopped him halfway. It was impossible to scare the spies without finding out exactly what they knew. It was necessary to turn this situation back to one's advantage. Change route at the last moment and avoid traps. I probably could have handled this on my own. But for the rest of the troops, it was necessary to find a safe place. Suddenly there was a mention of the people of arms, a name Henry had never heard before. He immediately became interested in the characteristics of this race. Although the forest dwellers lived their lives avoiding conflict with others, they swore an oath to the empire. They should not have refused to provide assistance to the imperial family. At that same moment, outside by the fire, Deborah, Marcus, and his guard decided to get some air. The woman, as always, started a conversation about the future and whether everyone would be safe. The man was quite categorical about the spies and hoped that the problem would be solved. In the midst of their rest, when Deborah and Marcus were chatting with each other, he suddenly heard some sounds coming from the nearby trees. The man jumped up and rushed to protect the people he trusted. They didn't even know that the guard could move so dexterously, and he, in turn, jumping from branch to branch, finally reached the desired point. Threatening the stranger with a sword, the man demanded that he come into the light. To his surprise, a moment later, he saw a beautiful elf in front of him, who fulfilled his request with a smile. A silent pause formed between the new acquaintances. The stranger was a representative of the arms people. Meanwhile, Henry in the tent couldn't believe his ears. He had only heard about elves in manga. It turns out that in this world they were absolutely real beings. And although there weren't that many of them, according to Leroy, it was a good chance. Every active, wealthy warrior of this race was worth 100 men in case of violent clashes. But there was only one problem left: how to contact them. So far, not a single one of their representatives has appeared on the horizon. While in the tent a plan was being drawn up on how to show initiative, the woman, smiling mysteriously, took a few steps towards the security guard. She said that she didn't appear here by chance. The forest itself announced the appearance of the imperial family, so she had an urgent message for the people who had found refuge here. The guard looked towards the camp. He needed to report this incident to Leo immediately. The prince, meanwhile, was entrusted with the mission of establishing communication between the elves and the people of Norman. He was supposed to go out searching in the morning, while the others would do their part of the mission. Leo's goal was to find his father, the emperor, and unite with him before marching on the capital. Of course, Lara didn't like this idea. He believed that he needed to protect himself first. But Henry did not claim the leading role in planning the fate of this world. He simply used his knowledge of espionage, which were developed over centuries of wars, direct and indirect confrontation between different peoples. By briefly covering historical events, namely the World and Cold Wars, the man captured the attention of those around him. Everyone was interested to hear about the terrible living conditions there. At least, that's how it seemed from the outside. Based on his skills, the sniper was confident that he could defeat the enemy with cunning and ingenuity. The last decades of practicing information warfare also came in handy. Public opinion sometimes became decisive for a split within the enemy camp. Therefore, he recommended to the prince to create a new intelligence unit, top secret with its own specific tasks. Obviously, Kurt had no choice but to refuse under these circumstances. He seemed to Leo to be the only candidate worthy of this title. The newly appointed commander took upon himself the obligation to carry out all assigned tasks in the best possible way. He could not fail his master. The crown prince could not even doubt his loyalty. Norman, in turn, suggested that Leo engage in agitation and information warfare in the enemy's state. He did not hide the fact that Henry's story inspired him to come up with this idea. While those present were considering how best to do this, the sentry announced Chris's arrival. Deborah's bodyguard demanded an urgent audience. No one knew that the man had really important news that would save them a lot of trouble. Chris told about the night card holder from the Arms clan, while the shocked members of the meeting silently looked at the guard. Leo politely invited the girl inside. A moment later, A beautiful blonde silently crossed the threshold of the tent. She came almost right up to the prince and respectfully greeted him, introducing herself. In the morning, they went together to the secret kingdom of the elven people. This was known only to a select few. The traitors believed that they would move in a pre-agreed direction. Henry, riding behind, did not take his eyes off the blonde. The elf's magic captured his mind and attention. The representative of the arms people herself almost immediately noticed his attention to herself. Just like Amber, who didn't miss the opportunity to make fun of her comrade. It was like falling in love, although the appointed specialist did not fully understand his feelings. But he didn't take into account that this girl, at first glance, was so young. In fact, it was about 300 years, while everyone was busy watching what was happening ahead. The princess, who arrived in a carriage behind, planned to discreetly pass on a message to the rebels. She released a handkerchief from her hand through the window, on which she had written a few words. The thing was immediately caught by the breeze and carried away in the designated direction. The message should soon find its addressee. And so it happened. The spy observers moved behind the column of the Imperial Army in no hurry. They were told not to manifest, but simply to transmit and receive messages. Half an hour later, Princess Deborah's handkerchief had already landed on the hand of one of the traitors. There was a changed destination written there, the secret city of the elves. This changed all the opponents' initial plans. It was necessary to report this to the management as quickly as possible. At first, the soldiers advanced in single file. Leroy gave orders and convinced the others that they would soon reach their target. Having reached the fork, the commander realized that it was time to begin the operation. The elf agreed on the actual route they would take. It was necessary to eliminate traitors among the reconnaissance units. This is exactly what Kurt's squad was supposed to do and did. The husband fulfilled his promise without deviating from his word in any way. Despite the fact that the detachment was small, the exposure operation was well carried out. The rest, pretending to follow the path laid out by the reconnaissance, were in fact following the elf. They could only wait for good news from Kurt, who was supposed to return to the city of the arms people later. When the last member of the secret intelligence unit disappeared into the forest, Leroy gave the order to break through. The scouts, among whom were traitors, rushed forward, and the army moved on its way. They believed that the danger had been averted, but they were wrong because they did not pay attention to anyone other than mere mortals. The princess's message was considered. The elves found a new enemy in the rebels. The location of the capital of the arms people was not difficult to find. All you need to do is follow the instructions of the noble spy. The new queen awaited a report from her loyal subject. The priestess was eating and wanted to hear the latest news. She, as always, was acting too condescendingly, but the interlocutor liked this behavior of the owner the most. The Imperial Army continued to advance deeper into the forest, the sunset already beginning to bother them. But the elf insisted that they needed to remain calm. Gradually, each soldier began to be enveloped in a strange fog. Visibility was getting worse with each passing second. Amber was worried that this could become their weak point in the event of a surprise attack. The sorcerer Lou also succumbed to the girl's influence. He loved to panic. Henry understood that this fog was not an ordinary natural phenomenon. It looked too contradictory. Most likely, it was some kind of trick, in the implementation of which magic helped. The elf only smiled in response to all the assumptions. She stopped a little ahead and said a few words in her language. A bright light filled the lawn and everything around. Affected people began to cover their faces to preserve their vision. When it was all over, the shock of those gathered became even greater. Henry was speechless, or rather, he forgot how to breathe. The princess and the little prince also looked out of the carriage. For the first time in several centuries, such a spectacle was revealed to the human race. Before them lay a majestic city, hidden from the rest of the world by a powerful spell. The stone buildings and palaces seemed amazingly beautiful. Giant viaducts crossed the gorges. It was impossible to imagine how this megapolis was built. The elf turned to the guests and said that they had the honor of looking at Le Fiodor. A few seconds had passed since the opening of the magic gate, but the situation had already changed dramatically. The new arrivals were surrounded by the city's defenders. The elves kept their meadows silently ready, waiting for an explanation. Subconsciously, Each armed man reached for his weapon in response. The blonde calmly began to explain who they were, and the new arrivals had the opportunity to listen to the euphony of the elven language. A moment later, access to the passage was restored, and it was possible to move forward. Henry watched with interest not only the behavior of the locals, but also their habits and clothing. Everything about this place inspired him. The man would never have thought in his life that he would end up here and be able to see elves for real. The newly arrived guests were placed in a specially designated camp on the city's territory. While the others were settling in, Prince Leo, accompanied by Leroy, went to the audience. According to the guide, they could feel safe here. For more than 1,000 years, no one has been able to overcome the magical barrier. The rest of the prince's teams decided to take in the views without rushing anywhere. Indeed, there was a lot to see around, but the locals missed the capital. While the comrades were talking about everyday topics, which was combined with the spreading of all sorts of rumors about elves. In front of Henry, suddenly, out of nowhere, a creature appeared that looked like a dragon, with a rider on its back. He looked up and saw a whole flock of such creatures flying above them. The specialist saw extraordinary potential in the air squadrons. He started talking about airplanes, which in turn brought up associations in Lu. It turned out that the airship that the sniper had seen earlier was called a flying boat here. But dragons, in our military opinion, had much greater potential due to their increased maneuverability. These creatures can give you a significant advantage over your opponent. In this world, they could be considered living fighters. Meanwhile, the Prince Viceroy had already reached the palace gates. The blonde explained that Queen Edith had previously granted the visitors the right to an audience. The guards standing on either side were different from the defenders they had encountered on the way here. Over 1,000 years of isolation, the elves developed a number of interacting structural divisions. But they still supported the monarchy and considered the queen's opinion an unshakable axiom. When the gates opened, people were met with an incredible phenomenon. The giant roots of the tree served as a throne for the ruler of this people. Even the prince opened his mouth in surprise. The elf, sitting motionless in front of them, was quite petite. She was considered a goddess here. So Leo respectfully turned to her first with congratulations. The queen welcomed the return guest and announced that she would provide them with as much shelter as they needed. Meanwhile, the dark army of rebels has already begun its advance on the kingdom hidden in the forests. Thanks to Princess Deborah, they knew exactly the location they needed to go to. The villains understood perfectly well what kind of army they would have to face, so they used their entire arsenal. By evening, news had already arrived in the princess's chambers. The woman opened the window and welcomed the postman bird into her home. Crook brought a letter that spoke of a full-scale offensive. The wait shouldn't be long. The Order of Flame will get what it wants, one way or another. The elves, who guarded all approaches to their habitat, encountered the enemy very soon. A skirmish broke out between them and the rebels. Judging by the number of troops heading into the city, an armed conflict was brewing. It was necessary to urgently warn the queen about what was happening. So the defenders had to split up, so that the message would arrive as quickly and without interference as possible. The remaining female scout was supposed to distract all the enemy's attention. She understood that this could be her last mission. The elf ran through the forest for several hours straight. Her pursuers did not allow her to rest for a second. The girl understood that if things continued like this, she would simply fall like a driven horse. Seeing the branched roots of a giant tree in front of her, the scout decided to hide there. She tried not to breathe at all as the enemies came very close to the cache. Reporting to the king about such a serious danger was worth all the effort. Meanwhile, in Le Féodor, no one had yet even suspected the approaching danger. Lou enthusiastically discussed the information about explosives that Henry shared. The sorcerer was amazed by the scale with which people in the sniper's world approached waging wars. The scale of the interlocutor's imagination was only enough to destroy a couple of buildings. But, as it turned out, the specialist was appointed from a world where one bomb could destroy a city. This information did not strike Amber in the best light. The woman did not understand such bloodthirstiness. The desire to destroy all living things so that no one would get them made the warrior shudder. Henry had no intention of explaining his point of view on the matter. There was a fact of using some kind of weapons in the world, and no one cared about the opinion of a particular person. Watching the flying dragons, the sniper once again thought about the superiority in the sky. It turns out that the troop of elven riders was called an Erexion. The sorcerer, as if having picked up the opinion of the Special Forces officer, began to produce experience from another world onto this one. He would like to craft something that would be suitable for creating an elven squadron. In turn, Henry noted that for greater effectiveness, even in the sky, tactics are needed. All group flights must be carried out in a clear formation. The mechanism of the rider's flight must maintain structure and coherence. While the sniper was saying all this, he didn't notice how he had captured the attention of the elves sitting nearby. One of them even approached the group of guests to inquire about the details of the dialogue, which immediately caused Amber's indignation. But in fact, the man did not want anything bad. He, like his comrades, wanted to learn something new. It turns out that the entire company at the next table occupied the position of dragon riders, and directly in front of the guests stood the unit commander himself, named Philip. When the elf turned his attention to his subordinates, they began to smile politely. The warriors wanted to show with all their appearance that they had friendly intentions and did not want to create trouble. They explained that they fly dragons just like that, without weapons, and this creates a certain discomfort. Everyone present would like to know what a machine gun or explosive is, which Henry spoke about with such enthusiasm. In turn, having listened to the needs of the majority, he announced that he must first talk about the fighters. Although the sniper had no professional connections with the Air Force, he knew the ins and outs of the force. And also, if the interlocutors knew at least something from the history of the world on Earth, they would be impressed. The man knew history almost perfectly and spoke about the events and tactics of the Second World War. He knew how and from whom the pilots of Germany at that time learned, and he wanted to adopt this experience now. The elves took away the main thing from all the sniper's explanations. All the announced changes would improve their unit. Obviously, Lou couldn't create something like a machine gun out of nothing, so the only hope was bombs. For the disciple of the former archmage of the imperial family, this shouldn't be a big problem. All that was required was to find time and provide a place for the exams. Philip was not against such help. On the contrary, it inspired him. He expressed a desire for Henry to help Erexione with modernization. Since the appointed specialist could not decide such issues on his own, he referred to Leo's will. The prince had to decide whether to improve the army of another nation. Meanwhile, negotiations with the Elven Queen were still ongoing at the highest levels. The governor tried to explain what measures he had taken to inform his people of the need for help. Of course, the fact that the messengers had not yet returned caused a slight alarm. Edith considered Le Féodor an impregnable fortress that could not be captured. She was not afraid to receive a prince wanted by the rebels, although she had heard a lot about them. The only thing that was annoying was that everyone around me was saying that the real killers had no moral standards. Therefore, the only choice was to unite their efforts to fight against a common enemy, if necessary. The elf, whose name turned out to be Emily, announced that the kingdom had a gift for Leo. It was obvious to the naked eye that the human troops had big problems with ammunition, so the people of arms decided to give them access to their arsenal. At about the same moment, the elf scout was finally able to reach the magical gate. She was barely breathing, but she wasn't going to lose consciousness that easily. Falling to the ground, the woman reached into her pocket to pull out the message. She handed it to her comrades, who stood around worriedly. Now everyone who needed to know about the army of enemies advancing on Le Féodor knew about it. Oblivion took the elf into its arms, and she finally got the opportunity to fully rest. Immediately after the incident in the dining room, the White Rabbit went in search of a convenient place for craftsmanship. He sat alone and came up with a formula for explosives of a fairly portable size, but of great power. Amber, who was eager to know the results, suddenly appeared nearby. As it turned out, the explosives did not have enough power to carry out the plan in its ideal form. But despite this, the enemy could still suffer significant damage. This was better than flying armed aircraft at all, so it was considered a significant breakthrough. The warrior's opinion was important to Lou, but not as much as Henry's approval would have been useful. He asked Amber to find a specialist appointee, but If the occasion arose to ask him to visit this place, an additional consultation could improve the matter. None of his comrades knew that at this time the sniper was giving a lecture to the Elven squadron. It was important for the dragon riders to learn more about combat tactics. Philip, frankly speaking, was delighted with the new information. He already wanted to try it out in practice. Amber, who entered the makeshift classroom, interrupted the lesson at the most interesting moment. The polite unit commander immediately greeted the girl with interest. He liked her. But now the warrior had no time for this. Count Leroy was looking for Henry. In addition, Lou also wanted to take up the sniper's time for a while. No one was interested in the circumstances in which the man found himself or the unfinished consultation. Fortunately, Philip did not insist on continuing the lecture. He respected Prince Leo. And the special purpose itself, of course, significantly increased the power of the Elven army in just one day. So the squad of horsemen said goodbye to their mentor until the next meeting. A few minutes later, Amber and Henry approached the large gates of one of the city's grand buildings. They had no idea what awaited them inside, but the order had to be carried out. Leroy was already waiting at the scene and was very happy to see the military man appear. He gave a signal to Emily and ordered the Queen's guests to be admitted. The gates of the city's main arsenal began to slowly open. Under the strict guidance of the Elven squad commander, the work progressed quite quickly. They all helped to open the entrance to the treasury of extraordinary artifacts. And when the deed was done, the representatives of the human race froze in their places. Even Amber froze in amazement. It was a huge room, filled from ceiling to floor with various types of weapons. Besides, it is very beautiful and in perfect condition. Despite the fact that the ammunition was many years old, it was imbued with divine power. Guests could choose whatever they wanted, depending on their needs. Everyone except Henry and Amber rushed forward to check out the prices. The sniper did not need additional weapons. He was satisfied with Lou's upgrades and equipment. The warrior did the same. The woman's swords did not need replacing. She looked after her helpers well. In that case, Leroy asked his comrades to help the others get their goodies. When the upgrade was in full swing, the city bell rang out a general alarm. The city was in danger, and now all the residents knew about it. The enemies had reached the borders, and it was necessary to take immediate measures to preserve their sovereignty. It was obvious to Henry that this was the work of the rebels. A little earlier, the Elven Queen received a message from the scout. She carefully read the document, which described the number of opponents as hundreds of thousands. It was much larger than the population of Le Fiodor, including the new guests. So Edith was very scared, although she tried not to show it to others. On Emily's advice, she ordered Philip to immediately go to defend the borders with the entire unit. The protector had to show the full power of the arms people and, if necessary, destroy the enemies. The squadron commander understood that the number of his men was significantly smaller than the enemy army. But he did not argue anymore, because Edith's attention had turned to Leo. The Queen wanted to create an alliance. Towards the end of this war, she proposed to join forces against a common enemy, and the prince approved. Emily was supposed to be preparing for a possible rebel invasion and battle in the city. Once the details were agreed upon and the tasks received, everyone set about doing their job. Members of the Orexi squadron flew to the borders of Le Fiodor. Of course, anxiety did not leave their hearts, but it was a good opportunity to try out the new gifts from the sorcerer of the human race in practice. A few minutes later, the first column of enemies was already visible below. It seemed that they walked only on the ground, without using the airspace. Therefore, as a warning and a stop, it was decided to attack the opponents first. One of the unit's squads flew a little higher into the sky to take a more advantageous position. Each of the warriors remembered well the smallest moments of the lecture of the appointed specialist. They used the maneuvers he had told them about with pinpoint precision. All that was left was to get closer and strike the first blow. When the air riders were noticed, they immediately began to defend themselves. Residents of arms had to go around dangerous areas and maneuver to avoid unexpected explosions. The High Priestess watched what was happening through the eyes of one of her followers. It was important for her to observe what was happening in the present tense. The woman's heart, full of hatred, seemed to blossom every time she saw the suffering of the imperialists. More than 20 years have passed since the day she learned what suffering was. But in the memory of the rebel ruler, everything happened as if it were yesterday. It grew up in the wilds of the capital. Her father was a priest, highly respected among the majority of the poor population, and his mother was his faithful assistant. Then, still young, a girl named Isabel adored her father so much that she never took her eyes off him. She liked the way people treated them, and the girl's only desire was to follow her father's example. Everything was interrupted by a terrible incident. No one expected the disaster that was rapidly approaching the charity procession. But then, screams were heard behind them, and everyone began to run away from the emperor's knights. Isabel remembered very well how her mother begged her husband to run away immediately. But he silently smiled back. The girl watched him go while his wife carried her child to safety in her arms. It seemed that the priest still had a chance to escape, but he didn't use it, didn't even try. The last thing Isabel remembered about her father was a knight piercing his chest with a spear. Years later, the woman was still unable to forgive her loss and blamed everyone for it. Both the emperor himself, his descendants, and all the henchmen of this regime. While the air squadron was facing its first battle, preparations were still in full swing inside the city. All human reserves were lined up on the square. Prince Leo decided to give a speech. He didn't want to force anyone, he just said it like it is. Behind everyone in Le Theodore were ordinary civilians. The soldiers were the empire's only hope for survival. And, as it turned out, everyone understood this. Henry, watching from the wall, was worried about one thing. Would help arrive? Amber, who was standing nearby, was of the opinion that they would not be left alone. But, most likely, you will have to survive the invasion on your own, because reinforcements will not arrive in time. The number of enemies was astonishing and promised a difficult night. Even if we involve all the able-bodied residents of this city, we still won't be able to collect more than 10,000. Therefore, it was necessary to come up with a strategy that would help avoid direct confrontation. The fall of the Elven Kingdom could not be allowed. Although the residents themselves had no intention of giving up, they considered Le Theodore the most precious thing they had in life and were ready to fight the invaders. No mercy was deserved by anyone who went to war against civilians. Within half an hour, an offensive horn was heard throughout the entire Elven capital. Henry watched the sun set over the forest ahead. It was a beautiful picture. If it weren't for the sounds of fighting that filled the air, the enemies were too close to the magic gates. One could already see the dragon riders. The troops seemed to be countless. Count Leroy rode out on horseback ahead of his troops. He ordered everyone to stand to the end, to hold on no matter what, and not to retreat. He had no intention of leaving the knights of the Empire to face this invasion alone. Meanwhile, Philip and the other horsemen finally encountered an equal opponent. It turned out that the rebels also had their own unit for air combat. This prompted the elves to change their formation a little and shift their focus. An additional squad of erection rushed into the forest to help their own. The defenders of the fortress, in turn, prepared to conduct fierce shelling of the enemy. The first dragons were about to engage in an aerial duel in an instant, and Henry, who had been searching for the desired goal all this time, finally breathed a sigh of relief. He saw the commander in the sight. This meant that the head of the snake could be cut off, thereby leaving the enemy without motivation. It remained to be hoped that this assumption was correct, because then the advantage in numbers was only an additional option. A bullet pierced the enemy commander's helmet right in the middle of his speech. And indeed, the infantry that was under his command began to look around in confusion. Philip immediately decided to take advantage of this and ordered his men to attack the villains. Leroy and Norman were the first to notice the siege towers rising above the forest cover. The rebel archers fired their first arrows at the enemy. The first salvo flew in the direction of the fortress. The defenders needed to take immediate care of their own safety. On the orders of the unit leader, the signalman indicated that the shooters needed to cover themselves with shields. Fortunately, the elven weapons allowed him to protect his body completely. Obviously, this is war, and not everyone could be lucky. But most of the soldiers were not injured. When the first wave of shelling ended, it was the turn of the Empire's defenders to fire their shot. Norman did not hesitate to give the command. A second later, the knights' arrows flew into the sky. The opponents did not have time to defend themselves against such a quick counterattack. But the danger had not passed. During this time, the siege towers had managed to get closer to the walls. The enemy's goal was to break through the defense, so it was necessary to prevent this. But no matter how hard the soldiers tried, they could not cause significant damage to this structure. Therefore, Count Leroy decided to take up the matter. He snatched a weapon from the nearest archer. Taking careful aim, the man was about to release the bowstring. But the unexpected appearance of a white rabbit, which activated magic around the arrow, stopped the nobleman. The sorcerer's goal was to strengthen the commander-in-chief's attack with flame magic. This one shot, in theory, should have destroyed the object it hit. Within a few seconds, the comrades moved from theory to practice. When the charged artifact reached the tower, its base exploded and shattered. The structure located above gradually began to collapse as well. Lu decided to speed up the process and force the first blow. He directed a stream of fiery, destructive magic towards the building. Within a second, all the allies burst into cries of delight as the bright light buried the tower within itself. When the first stage of alarm was passed and the way was laid, the elves also joined the cause. The same thing was done with the other structures. But, as it turned out, this was only the beginning. Large boulders appeared above the forest, heading towards the fortress. Norman ordered everyone inside to prepare for the inevitable collision. The stones were striking in their size. Each one of them was capable of destroying a building. Everyone understood that if the catapults were not stopped, the shelling would continue. So the White Rabbit decided to identify the location of the enemy artillery. When this was successful, Lu returned back almost instantly. He informed the Allied artillery commander of the exact coordinates for the shot. A second later, the order was given to open fire. The catapults inside the fortress threw up the bombs that the sorcerer had been working on. Of course, they were inferior in size to the weapons of their opponents, but the combat power of these little creatures was far superior to their predecessors. Leroy exhaled happily. One problem less. But there were still thousands of enemies to deal with. For this case, the team had Kevin's mind, and now they placed their hopes only on him. Of course, the military man got out of the situation as best he could. But he was not going to give up. This could not be done because the war had been won and the way home lay ahead. So the man vowed to do everything possible to complete the mission successfully. The chief gate guard ordered the passage to be opened. The squad, consisting of several horsemen, Amber and a special agent, prepared to leave. The warriors stood at the head and gave all other orders. All the elves moving nearby were focused on a specific goal. Although they did not know the man riding behind them on the horse, he had already done a lot for many. When the detachment with the sniper left the gate, the rest of the information was reported to the signalman. Everything was agreed upon. At first glance, going against the enemy in such numbers seemed like madness. But Amber acted with an exceptional miscalculation, which the team had agreed on earlier. They needed to distract the attention of their opponents with their rapid breakthrough. The only active action until the signal was given from the fortress was to be a battle. Meanwhile, the soldiers were in trouble inside the city. One of the siege towers, however, fell into the hands of the fortress, avoiding a clash. A fierce shelling of the buildings behind the wall began. The Imperial Army's catapults were also hit. The White Rabbit saw with his own eyes how sparks from the flames of the explosion licked his bombs. But he didn't have time to do anything, because a moment later, the blast wave threw him back. The wounded shooters, despite their injuries, continued to fight. The platoon commander ordered his men to fire at least one shot from the catapult. And it did have an effect, and damage was done to the rebel soldiers. But the siege tower could no longer be stopped. It had reached the wall. Norman quickly ordered the defenders to kill anyone who stepped on the hard surface. And indeed, just a few seconds later, the scoundrels had the audacity to land on the fortress wall. The soldiers fought with all their might. Both swords and meadows were used. Norman was not going to stand aside either. He rushed forward to help his brothers. Meanwhile, Count Leroy and his infantry fought behind the walls of the fortress. He was so absorbed in the duel that he did not notice the scoundrel lurking to kill him. If it weren't for his comrade's call, the man wouldn't have even looked back. Although this also did not change the situation much. The commander-in-chief was saved by unexpected help. The traitor received a blade in the chest, never understanding how this could have happened. The rescuer turned out to be none other than the bodyguard of Princess Deborah and Marcus. Somehow, in the chaos of the last few days, Leroy's memory had erased Chris's skill. But now the man remembered that he was considered the first swordmaster of the Empire. That is why he was once, in peacetime, chosen for the position of guard of the little prince. The explosions in the forest distracted the Count's attention, and the situation remained too difficult for the defenders. The enemy's numerical superiority did not allow the army to defend even the fortress walls from siege towers. The commander hoped that Henry's detachment had almost reached the planned point. Amber commanded her subordinates with her gaze. They understood the girl without words, as if they had been working side by side for many years. Obviously, what they were doing now was a complete gamble. But without tricks, this war could not be won. So the elves allowed themselves to go to extremes. And to do this, it was necessary to eliminate enemies along the way to the target. For the first time in his military career, the sniper fired while riding a horse. It turned out to be quite a successful experience. The man's skill was amazing. The elves of the squad followed his example. The archers from the fortress helped as best they could. They cleared the way of all possible obstacles. Enemy siege towers and catapults exploded and shattered into pieces. Enemies could not be spared. Amber reminded him of this almost every minute. Their lives could have cost the lives of someone close to them inside Le Fiodor. When the next barrier that needed to be overcome was reached, the warrior gave the order to shoot. Having obediently fulfilled the demand, the squad members eliminated more villains along the way, and the survivors took up their shields for the first time in this battle. It turned out that the treacherous enemy commander was saving his assets and decided to use cavalry. But he paid for it at that very moment. Despite the elimination of the main clash with the enemy, it was already impossible to avoid. Rebels on monsters and elves on horses met in a confrontation. The owners of this land were so enraged that the enemies had no chance of survival. The elves' tenacity in defending their fortress did not need any additional reinforcement or motivation, and it finally worked. The soldiers of the enemy army began to run away. They were saving their vile lives out of fear. But they didn't know that chasing them wasn't part of the plan. You had to keep moving forward to hit the target. One of the elves threw forward an explosive projectile that had created the white rabbit the day before. Henry watched him through the scope of his rifle. The trifle hit right from the wheel of one of the enemy catapults. It was a good start. For it to work, a trigger was needed. It was the sniper who was supposed to act as the activator. Then the magical flame should have burst out and destroyed the object. During the conversation with the sorcerer, everything seemed much simpler than it seemed now. Then the briefing went quite quickly and easily. The Special Forces officer even managed to listen to a little magic lecture. But now, with the battle raging around him, for some reason, he couldn't concentrate. Amber tried to bring the man to his senses, and he himself saw perfectly well that he needed to speed up. The rest of the squads covered him with their bodies, despite the mortal danger. The first shot was false. Nerves got the better of him. Fortunately, the warrior's voice and magic bullets allowed him to concentrate better. The bullet flew out of the barrel of the rifle with a special whistle. A moment later, a powerful explosion was heard, signaling the destruction of enemy equipment. This time, Amber was pleased. They were able to reduce the pressure on the fortress. But this was not the end. The rest of the catapults must follow the example of the first. The elves continued to stand guard over the sniper while he restored order around the city. And he, in turn, did his job with concentration and conscientiousness. The catapult explosions became a nuisance for the enemy. Therefore, the next rebel commander ordered the destruction of a detachment of people and elves. The enemy soldiers drew their bows and prepared to shoot. Amber, seeing this, ordered everyone to hide behind their shields. The woman seemed to have taken everything into account. Indeed, the timely warning worked successfully, and there were no losses among the detachment members. But the same could not be said about the warrior herself. The arrow pierced her shoulder. She looked at the specialist to make sure that the time for the decisive goal had come. Judging by the military man's opinion, he was more confident in his abilities than ever, especially when she saw her friend's determined look. He was just waiting for a signal, so the woman didn't delay any longer and launched the rocket into the sky. The entire battlefield was illuminated by a blue light. Philip even looked up from his battle. The commander of the erection already had a premonition of what the finale would be and was incredibly happy about it. The writer understood perfectly well that his detachment of brothers needed help with their retreat. So he ordered his men to attack the shooters who were preventing this from happening. The squadron quickly turned in the opposite direction from their former opponents, and they, in turn, began to look around in confusion. They did not understand such a sudden retreat. The most important thing for the elves now was to cover the back of their human race mentor. On Philip's command, bags of explosives were dropped directly on the heads of the enemies. There were enough of them to make the blow more painful. At first, the shooters did not notice the unexpected counterattack. They were focused on ground targets. But, a moment later, they screamed in pain as the flames of the explosions engulfed their bodies. Seeing this, Amber immediately gave the order to retreat to the fortress. It was impossible to waste such a fortunate moment. Meanwhile, Count Leroy also decided to enter the game. He gave the signal to his people in the fortress. Lu, who had been watching the commander closely, notified the military that they needed to open fire. In turn, they did not hesitate for long. The catapults were filled to capacity, and the first bombs flew towards the enemy. Powerful explosions were heard, as if a fiery avalanche had descended upon the enemy. Amber, without stopping her movement, saw that an army was approaching the meeting from the fortress wall. It was Prince Leo, surrounded by knights. The defense of the wall continued with even more fierce zeal. Even hot oil was used. It was very good for pouring it on siege towers so that they could then be set on fire. Thus, those who moved them had no chance to escape alive. Soon, Amber's squad and Leo's squad came face to face. The prince and the warrior looked at each other silently for a few seconds, and then an order came from the viceroy of the imperial throne to destroy all enemies. By charging swiftly, the knights on horseback managed to avoid serious resistance. At least that's how it seemed at first. But a flare from the enemy commander changed the course of the battle. When she soared into the sky, none of the people or elves understood what this would lead to. It turned out that in this way, heavy artillery was introduced into the battle. Giant rhinoceroses. They were heading straight for Leo's unit, trying to cut him off from the main rebel forces. Fortunately, the defenders of the arms people also did not use all their forces. The commander of the 3rd Division and the chief protector of the Elven Queen was ready to enter the battle. The Elven infantry listened silently to his instructions and agreed with every word. They weren't going to die just like that today. It was the enemy's turn to pay the bills, and Commander Scott was eager to help them do so. Together with Ember's squad, which had deployed on the move, they entered the battle. It was impossible to abandon the prince in trouble. Everything depended on his salvation, including Henry's return to his world. Despite the fact that the freaks with horns were the size of a good mammoth, none of the defenders were going to retreat. It was Scott who first encountered the giants, and although several of his comrades died almost instantly, he himself was spared this fate. There was little that could be done against such tough skin, and that did not mean turning back. After all, it was those who controlled these monsters who were in front. The elves fearlessly entered into battle with them. They avenged their fallen comrades, and they didn't want to take anyone prisoner. Leroy was already on the wall at this time and was watching the progress of the battle. He saw everything that was happening below and experienced the result of the future sabotage. Humanity still had an ace up its sleeve, a trick that would allow many rebels to be destroyed in one blow. It was Henry who had to do it, to break the tide of the battle. The Elven Queen, who was present at the last meeting, allowed extreme measures to be taken if necessary. There was a protective barrier around the entire perimeter of the city that had to be activated at the right points. Lu, as a sorcerer, immediately sensed the hotbeds of magic and pointed to them. In order to achieve the best effect, the people of arms allowed the enemy to get so close to the walls of Le Fiodor. They were supposed to be inside the protective circle, and the shooter had to get close enough to fire the activation shot. It was a risky maneuver that was to be used as a last resort. Which one has just arrived? Moving forward, Henry waited only for the signal from the fortress. He wasn't even going to start aiming without an agreed-upon command. No matter how difficult the situation may seem, the prince was also in no hurry, despite Amber's screams. He insisted that we had to hold out for a little while. At that moment, Their unit was cutting through enemy columns as if they were cutting butter. Henry looked back. He already saw his target ahead and wanted to see the signal from the fortress. The White Rabbit took this as an agreement. Together with other magicians, he began to generate energy. A moment later, the sky was illuminated by a blue full moon. The Special Forces soldier looked at the cartridge in his hand. The sorcerer managed to make only one means to activate the protective barrier. So it was a decisive moment for the defenders of Le Fiodor. He had no right to make a mistake. In his sights, the soldier saw all the enemies rushing around the battlefield. He tried to catch the desired stone with his eye, which was almost always blocked by someone's figure. Suddenly, the horizon became clear, and the sniper seized the moment. He pulled the trigger without dismounting from his horse, but hoping that the bullet would not find someone's body along the way. Fortunately, that's exactly what happened. The magic stone was hit by the White Rabbit's ball and began to crack. The sign of the pentagram began to appear evenly around him. The light grew brighter, creating an aurora borealis in the sky, against the background of which additional magical pentagrams began to appear above the enemies. The sorcerers of the Imperial Army immediately set about strengthening the protective barrier. None of the Elven Cell's defenders were to be harmed. The members of the enemy army tensed up. They didn't know what to do in such situations. And this moment turned out to be favorable for a powerful attack. Bright lightning bolts, destroying all living things, found each of the rebels, which was located inside the protective circle, large and small, bypassing in his rage both the human helpers and the local residents. The prince was amazed by this sight and was glad that he was on the right side. Almost reduced to ashes, the enemies lay on the ground unbroken, no longer posing a threat. The amazing trick was only possible thanks to the precision of the appointed specialist. But the battle could not yet be considered over, because there were also those rebel units that were still waiting for their release. And now, watching as the most powerful beings of their army died, they decided to retreat. This escape could not be allowed. The extermination of the fugitives now guaranteed fewer of them tomorrow. It took about half an hour to clear the battlefield. After this, the army of the Empire and the elves began to celebrate the victory. The queen was incredibly pleased. The danger to her life had passed for now. The defenders understood perfectly well that today was only the beginning. But such a massive offensive took away a lot of their explosives and strength. A thorough audit was urgently needed, and prepare for the next cycle of defense, waiting for reinforcements. If the pressure of the next attack cannot be maintained, everyone will end up in the ruins of Le Fiodor. None of those present knew what was happening to Kurt Rias. Meanwhile, the husband was moving forward in the forest with his comrades. They were heading to meet the entire scout team, which was supposed to bring reinforcements. Gradually, more and more people came, and everyone had good news. Everyone the prince called agreed. Now all that was left was to get to Le Fiodoru in time. No one wanted this to work out as much as Kurt did. Meanwhile, at night, no one slept in the Elven fortress. Another meeting was taking place. Leo expected reinforcements tomorrow afternoon. All that was left was to somehow hold out until now and not allow the fortress to fall. In the context of today's confrontation, the situation can be called extremely complex. The prince saw warriors on the street helping each other to patch up their wounds. The defenders were very tired, and there was a shortage of ammunition. The White Rabbit did everything he could to achieve today's victory. But for tomorrow, this was critically insufficient. The prince did not hesitate to admit that he had no ideas on how to solve the urgent shortage. That's why this time he relied on the ideas of a specialist. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Kurt recalled his negotiations with the three leaders of the friendly fortresses. One of them was Baron Wayne, the manager of the Irison Fortress, an arrogant man at first glance. The other is Viscount Gregg, the manager of the fortress of Doran Gregg, and also Viscount Winston, the strictest of all, the head of the Cahors Fortress. They all arrived with the same obvious thought. The prince needed their help. But three fortresses were not enough to provide sufficient resistance, so the news that Count Shane had also volunteered to help was met with great enthusiasm. In the opinion of the three nobles, with such forces, they could already compete with the enemy. At this point, negotiations began regarding the size of each group. When the count had been carried out to the last man, Baron Wayne's mood improved considerably. The man seemed to have completely relaxed, believing that victory was literally in his pocket. But the main problem remained to get to Le Fiodor on time. In order not to prolong the meeting any further, Kurt suggested going to Prince Leo at dawn. According to the plan, Count Shane was supposed to arrive there later, but no one was going to wait for him. There was no time. While reinforcements were gathering several dozen kilometers from the elven cell, the sun rose. The sentries on the wall of Le Fiodor Fortress silently watched the horizon. The first of them, who saw the approach of the enemy, blew his war horn. Through the smoke and fog of dawn, the approach of the fighting rhinoceroses could be seen. They walked in a line behind a large number of human rebel infantry. It was as if there had been no battle at all yesterday. The number of enemies was truly astonishing, as is their rage and focus on the outcome. The destruction of the elven cell was supposed to happen today. The commander of the traitor unit gave the order to attack. Apart from his voice, not even the singing of birds could be heard over the battlefield. Yes, 2 hours passed in intense fighting. The fortress was under heavy siege. The sorcerers tried to do everything in their power to prevent the towers from approaching the wall. But the enemy's advance could no longer be stopped. The allies simply had nothing to defend themselves with. They had run out of ammunition. Suddenly, one of the knights ran up to Count Leroy. This was evidence that Henry's idea of a defensive strategy had already been completely exhausted. The subordinate insisted that the commander make a decision on further actions as soon as possible. It was obvious that there was no point in further resistance. We needed to think about evacuation. And this needs to be done urgently, because the army at the gate could soon get inside. Using a battering ram, the rebels tried to make a hole in the strong tree. Henry tried to do everything in his power to eliminate the villains one by one. He took the most advantageous position from which to assess the situation at the entrance to the fortress. But even a sniper rifle, in the military man's opinion, was not effective in this situation. The specialist saw that Leroy was hesitating to make a decision. Retreating was never easy, but here it was necessary to take care to gain time. In the end, the Count made the decision and took responsibility for himself. He ordered Norman to immediately give the order to open fire with flaming arrows. Dozens of archers fired their arrows downwards. Henry's plan was for the White Rabbit to dig a ditch there and fill it with oil. The first arrow that touched the liquid caused a powerful burst of flame that consumed everything. Within a moment, all the towers crossing this stream were engulfed in flames. The nearby rebels, confused and frightened, tried to escape. But the archers' arrows finished them off halfway. The commander of the enemy troops only smiled in response. Today he was ready for any tricks of the enemy. It was obvious that the defenders were expecting reinforcements. But the villains also knew all about this, and they prepared a trap. Kurt, together with 3 nobles and their men, advanced through the dark thickets of the forest. They had been on the road for a long time, and it would be nice to rest. But this was not destined to happen, because the path of the allies of the Imperial Army was crossed by Isabel's assistant. She, smiling brazenly, immediately irritated Baron Wayne. The more the manager of the Irison fortress became indignant, the more the madwoman laughed in response. She snapped her fingers and promised her interlocutor a meeting in hell. After this, some kind of incomprehensible whistle rose in the air. Kurt looked up and realized with horror that this was an attack. A trap was waiting for them in the middle of the forest. A large piece of rock was about to land on top of the soldiers. Those who managed to escape the collision rightly believed that they were simply lucky. The Baron did not have as good a reaction as his younger subordinates. Therefore, I only had time to look back to see the attacker, or rather, to see the place where she had been before. Because the woman was already behind Wayne, the villain did not hesitate to plunge her sword into his back. Kurt didn't have time to help. His opponent was too fast. The Baron was choking on his own blood and could no longer speak. And the High Priestess's accomplice chose a new victim for herself. She rushed to the side with the intention of killing Viscount Greg, who was reckless and lost his horse. But the man turned out to be too attentive for the insidious killer. He was already waiting for her with a sword. A scuffle broke out between the 2 opponents. They were not inferior to each other in skill, so no one could gain an advantage. Meanwhile, the stone giants, created with the help of dark magic, were already preparing for a new attack. Each of them tore off a sizable chunk of stone from the rock and threw it towards the allied forces of the Empire. Nothing could be done against such an invasion. Kurt knew he needed to disperse immediately to survive. The man grabbed the Baron and gave the order. The scout ordered everyone to run into the forest and not move along the roads. This didn't mean running back. On the contrary, in this way, Kurt tried to break through as quickly as possible towards the fortress of Le Fiodor. The Prince Vice-Governor was expecting reinforcements, and they could not let him down. The young man's determination pleased Viscount Winston. He agreed to the scout's plan with a smile and promised to get to the Elven city. He also saw no point in turning back and retreating from the first plan. They were going to war, so danger and human casualties were inevitable. Meanwhile, Greg was still fighting with Isabel's assistant. This allowed all the soldiers to find their horses and follow the scout to his destination. On the other side of the forest, the battle was still going on. Despite the losses of the opponents, the fate of the fortress hung in the balance. It was necessary to immediately agree on the following actions with the prince. Leroy tried to convince the nobleman that, despite the difficult choice, this was the right decision. It was necessary to abandon our people and flee in a small detachment, because the enemy commander was already preparing for a new wave of attacks. The rebels blew their horns. This turned the interlocutor's attention to the battlefield. At first, nothing seemed to happen. But then the earth shook and began to crack. In front of the astonished eyes of the military on both sides, a giant worm emerged from the ground, like some kind of whale in the middle of the ocean. He was not alone. The source of penetration of these monsters could be observed in several directions. Leo was confused. It was the first time he had seen such monsters. Meanwhile, the worms were heading towards the fortress. Without the help of magic, defense was impossible. The first soldiers outside the wall saw the monster within a few seconds. None of them believed their eyes. It was a real giant with a giant horn on its face. He growled furiously, causing the bricks of the fortress wall to shake. A second later, the ugly thing hit the wall. The blow proved fatal, and several defenders died falling from a height. Leroy ordered everyone to mobilize immediately and stop the creature's advance. The archers and sorcerers set to work. But no matter how hard they tried, they failed to cause significant damage to the enemy. Philip, seeing the breakthrough, sent his unit to help. The elves used bombs made by Lou against the boring worm. From the sorcerer's observations, this was indeed a painful experience for the monster. So he decided to help and threw in a few more explosive shells. The flames proved more effective than the arrows. It forced the villain to hide underground. But only for a few minutes he appeared within the walls of the fortress to eat the soldiers and catapults. At this point, even Henry realized that it was a losing proposition. Leroy began to pull the prince along, although he resisted. Now there was no time to think. Evacuation was necessary for survival. Leroy honestly and calmly noted to His Highness that he considered this the most appropriate, despite the great sacrifices among his people, who will fight to the last, just so that the imperial family could escape. This battle was over for the people, but for the struggle to continue, the descendants of the emperor had to survive. Despite all the commander's reasonable arguments, the prince could not bring himself to listen to the advice. Leo could not simply give up and abandon the kingdom that had extended a helping hand to him. At some point in the conversation, Leroy lost his inner balance. He loved the prince so much that he resorted to personal language, a language he never used. He sincerely believed that Leo would become an unrivaled ruler if he did not die today. The husband promised to remember this day and take revenge on the enemies for all the suffering and death. The count even swore to personally find and kill the commander of the enemy army. Such a fiery speech from a man who always had a cool head astonished the nobleman. The prince made a decision, even though he didn't like it. Raising his sword, Leo gave the order to everyone who could hear him. They were to evacuate the fortress. A rapid retreat began. The team spread across the battlefield by word of mouth. While Le Fiodor was left behind, the ruler could only think about the survival of the majority. When the danger to reinforcements had passed, Kurt decided to leave the horses and continue on foot. He didn't even notice when Greg managed to join the squad. The man turned out to be more agile, much more agile than his venerable age would allow. He thanked the scout for his resourcefulness because it was thanks to it that so many lives were saved. This compliment made Kurt smile and forget about his worries for a moment. Besides the prince and saving the empire, the man wanted most of all to help his father. For some time he and his interlocutor moved forward in silence, but both were uneasy about the fact that Viscount Winston had not yet appeared. He could have fallen into another trap. The villains were capable of anything to gain a strategic advantage. Suddenly, the forest thickets began to crackle somewhere nearby. The soldiers tensed, grabbing their weapons. A second later, people breathed a sigh of relief. Winston appeared from the darkness. The husband looked at those present with a penetrating gaze, without saying a word. Having united, the trio of leaders decided to take a short break. During the rest, Kurt told those present about the peculiarities of the local area. They were already close to the fortress. The lack of pursuit was strange. The arriving Viscount cherished the hope that the enemies had been forced to abandon their plans. But Greg and the scout did not share the same opinion. Just in case, Kurt sent a messenger to Le Fiodor to inform him of help. But that didn't mean they didn't need to look around themselves. Winston's sudden question confused Norman's son. The Viscount was worried about the appearance of an unknown warrior in the prince's immediate circle. There were rumors that this was a servant of His Excellency, and a rather authoritative one at that. But Kurt decided to explain the situation down to the smallest detail, referring to the sniper's abilities. Greg, unlike Winston, did not take this information with such hostility. He trusted Leo's judgment. If Henry was allowed this close, it meant he was worthy. The most important thing for the Viscount was to understand what kind of character the special appointee had. While the camp was still going on in the forest, the Elven Kingdom was in stagnation. The soldiers tried to lead everyone away from the enemies along the safest roads. Queen Edith, accompanied by Emily, also left Le Fiodor. Although the assistant insisted on a quick pace of progress, Her Majesty could not leave so easily. She was waiting for her beloved giant Scott to appear. And when it appeared, literally out of nowhere, I instantly calmed down. From that moment on, the evacuation didn't seem so scary. Therefore, Her Majesty happily agreed to all of Emily's conditions. The number of people inside the fortress became fewer and fewer. And although the defenders were in trouble, overall everything worked out for the best. Until a bloody mason appeared on one of the streets. It appeared right in the path of civilians who were unable to resist. Amber noticed the monster in time, but was unable to prevent a catastrophe. The warrior was beaten to the punch by the sniper as the monster raised his axe over the elven women. The bullet pierced the giant's forehead, and he fell to the ground like a felled tree. The elves stood there, shocked, until Ember yelled at them, and Henry continued his work, looking for new targets. He wanted to save as many lives as possible in this total disaster. While the fighting was going on inside the fortress, things outside it also changed somewhat. A horseman rode onto the battlefield. He surveyed the destruction around him, not ignoring a single detail. After which, he took off his helmet. It was Count Shane himself, and now the man was angry with himself for being late. His assistant waited tensely for orders. After thinking about all the options for a while, the solution came to me by itself. The Count decided to split up, leaving his vassal with 100 warriors in the fortress until reinforcements arrived. The man himself wanted to find the prince. He immediately realized that he had left this place. Shane could do this with ease with the help of his trusty winged friend. At his call, the bird immediately landed on his hand, awaiting orders. This falcon was trained to search for prey in the green thickets. The predator could quickly cope with such a difficult task. All that was left was to follow him. Count Shane had no equal in pursuit, but Henry was quick to notice the surveillance. Now the man was looking closely at the bird, which continued to circle above them in the sky. This looked rather strange, because for the falcon, people were not prey to be hunted. So far, the special agent was unwilling to share his suspicions with anyone else. The prince ordered everyone to stop at a campsite and rest a little. This was not a good idea either, because the persecution of the imperial family was inevitable. They sat under the tree with Amber and shared food. She couldn't get her friend to talk. He kept looking in Leo's direction. The viceroy was also restless, feeling guilty for the loss. The warrior did not like the feeling of shame and disgrace. She was looking for revenge, as always, and was eager to get into a new fight to prove her superiority. In the current situation, the woman, of course, understood that there was no other choice. But she tried to motivate Henry not to give up and plan for the next confrontation. The man himself understood perfectly well that this could not be avoided while the rebels were hunting Leo. For some reason, during these moments of rest, thoughts about family filled my head. The Special Forces soldier missed his sister incredibly. It seemed to him that they had not seen each other for an eternity. Henry was very happy when Helen entered university. She became the pride of the family. No one knew that in a few months everything would change dramatically. When the sniper received a call from the hospital, he was on duty. Seeing a missed call, the man decided to call back and learned terrible news. Dropping everything, Henry ran to ask for an urgent leave. At that moment, he didn't care about his career or the fate of others. When the man arrived at the hospital, he saw his mother standing confusedly in front of the operating room door. Then he never had time to find out what happened, why Helen was here. At the time, it seemed completely unimportant, especially when the doctor came out to them with some bad news. The surgeon did everything he could. All that was left was to wait and hope for a miracle. Since then, my sister has remained in the hospital, under observation and connected to machines. She was in a coma from which she did not want to return yet. Henry, being in another world, hoped that everything had finally worked out at home. The worst thing was that he couldn't share personal information with anyone. No one would understand him. The scouts sent to make sure there was no pursuit returned. Elves and people were waiting for news, which turned out to be disappointing. They were being searched for. The rebels did not give up in their quest to destroy the Empire. Henry knew he had to change tactics. They could be caught at any moment. And then everyone will be in danger of extermination, while the soldiers of the Empire played by someone else's rules. Now the specialist intended for Leroy to install his own. The soldier explained that it was necessary to form as many stop lines for the enemy as possible, each of which will be a difficult obstacle that will take the lives of the villains. Of course, this idea did not find support due to the large number of the enemy army. But that was at first, because later it became clear that there were no other options. Henry volunteered to take charge and delay the opponents if possible. He asked to provide him with about 600 like-minded people to set traps. Among them, there must definitely be sorcerers, soldiers, and knights. Despite the commander's objections, the prince decided to satisfy the sniper's need. He was only interested in one thing: how much time the others would have to escape. Having thought over his answer, the specialist promised to delay the enemies for no more than 2 days. It was better than nothing at all. The Krosina Gorge would have been an ideal hiding place for refugees. She was just nearby, and Leo decided to lead everyone in that direction. Henry strongly supported the prince's initiative. They quickly came to an agreement on everything, despite the count, who could not find a negative. There was nothing to discuss because no one present had any idea. All that remained was to complete the assigned tasks. Now it was necessary to choose who exactly would join the Special Forces unit. Emily promised that some elves would also stay to help. Scott also could not stand aside and volunteered with his warriors. All this happened in full view of Deborah, who suffered incredibly from her betrayal. She mentioned real life in the capital in Leo's absence, about how all the local residents began to worship the High Priestess. Bishop Isabel came into power too quickly. No one had time to notice before power passed to her. At first, it was decided to carry out a total demonstrative purge in order to establish the regime. Then, by order of the priestess, 5 people were burned at once in the so-called purification ritual. It was a terrible sight, especially considering the cheers from the crowd. At that time, no one ever found out who the lady was, who was standing next to Isabel. Her face was covered by a large hood, leaving her face incognito. Having done her job, the stranger entered the palace. She walked up to the magic ball and looked at her face. On her new face, which no longer belonged to Princess Deborah, the woman knew perfectly well that the rebels would not retreat from their goal. The falcon, meanwhile, informed its owner of the approach to the desired object. Count Shane was pleased with the search and immediately rewarded his bird. It was enough for the predator to get a little affection from his owner, because he could have shot his own prey. While the situation in the forest was escalating, Kurt and reinforcements approached the ruined walls of the fortress. The scout fell to his knees at what he saw. He was afraid to learn the terrible truth. Tears streamed down the scout's face. He truly believed that he deserved to die for not making it in time. But the husband's melancholy was stopped by a remark from Viscount Winston. According to the man, this was not the end. He pointed to tracks leading into the forest. A large number of horses have recently traveled northwards. This could mean that the prince left the fortress along with the soldiers and residents. He was alive, and it was not too late to join in and protect the viceroy. The conversations behind the wall attracted the attention of Count Shane's archers. As they targeted the new arrivals, the soldiers in turn prepared for a fight. The fight was stopped by the voice of the squad's vassal, who had called Baron Wayne. I had to explain that he was wounded and unconscious. The interlocutor inquired about the identities of the others. Winston stated his name, position, and the fortress he represented. The man was amazed at how far Prince Leo's scouts had advanced. He called himself Raymond and said that he was a vassal of Count Shane. Once it became clear that they were on the same side of the conflict, everyone calmed down. The interlocutor reported that the nobleman was pursuing the prince, who had disappeared before their arrival. At that moment, Kurt actually breathed a sigh of relief. Now he was eager to join Leo. The column of evacuees began its journey slowly, leaving all those who wanted to go behind. Everyone was waiting for Deborah to arrive, as she had forgotten to pick up an important trifle at the previous stop. Finally, the princess caught up with her carriage. She happily showed Marcus the key. But she explained this necessity by her father's will, and the guard did not object. He did not interfere in personal affairs, trusting too much in those he shouldn't have. The carriage moved forward. At first, everyone who remained on the lawn moved in silence. Even Amber, whose head was swarming with different thoughts. Suddenly, the woman approached Henry with an offer to move to the next level. It was necessary to be down to business. Therefore, the appointed specialist began to give orders. The soldiers had to learn how to make traps. Before this, choose the ideal places for this, which are impossible to bypass. Thoughts of meeting the archmage of this world and returning home warmed the man's heart, as well as against the infantry mine, which Henry saved until the last. For the magicians, the sniper had his own task. Led by the White Rabbit, they had to dig trenches. To be honest, with the help of witchcraft, this matter progressed quite quickly. Henry even thought that it would be nice to have such allies at home to make his life easier. Of course, there were many options for the enemy army to move. Therefore, the scoundrels had to be forced to go along this road. Although it was risky, the game had to go strictly according to plan, without deviations. Because the presence of quality fortifications and trenches, even during World War II, saved many lives. Such obstacles became a significant obstacle for any enemy equipment. Since no one here used poison or gas, there was no need to worry in the presence of like-minded people. Fortifications alone, of course, were not enough. So Henry had one more small proposal for Lou. Using magic, he had to create traps that would not be noticeable. This time the sorcerer tried his best. He generated a fairly powerful spell. This time the energy glowed green. The special forces became interested in what else this little white rabbit was capable of. After a few seconds, sprouts began to break through the ground. They were so big and powerful that they looked like pillars. But when the growth of the bush stopped, it could be mistaken for ordinary green branches of plants. They blocked each of the 3 approaches to the lawn. Therefore, in order to delay his opponents, the sniper came up with the idea of dividing the power of the anti-personnel mine into 3 parts. They were supposed to trigger the explosions at the right time. This time, too, Lou's curiosity and intelligence came in handy in carrying out the military man's plans. Although the White Rabbit doubted the success of this project, Henry was a master of traps, so he knew how to get someone to do what he wanted. The remaining sorcerers worked to destroy any small passages in unplanned places. By forcing the rebels to walk along the desired path, you can provoke panic among them. This would be a gift for the detachment of restrainers. Amber liked this idea the most. She wanted to see the fear of death in the eyes of her opponent. While no one was looking, the Special Forces officer tried to get his anxiety under control. He was determined to ensure that this time, too, the Imperial Army would not lose heart. Soon, the rebel search party appeared very close to the desired location. All that was needed was to turn them slightly to the side. For these reasons, the sorcerers created the most ordinary, impassable swamp on the site of the giant mountain. A little confused, the riders nevertheless turned onto the desired path. It was unreasonable to hope that the prince and his men would have overcome such terrain. In that case, they simply could not survive. And the priestess's wish has already been fulfilled. To be more confident in his rightness, the enemy commander directed his horse onto the right path. At that time, the detachment of restrainers was waiting for the first guests. No one came out of the trenches. Everyone was carefully watching the horizon. The enemy was still not visible, and doubts began to awaken in the hearts of the elves. But Henry himself believed that the rebels would never abandon the pursuit. During all this time, the specialist realized that they were simply incapable of retreat. Lu hoped his comrade was right because he wanted to see the consequences of using his magic in an unconventional way. Over the past few days, the sorcerer has learned many new tricks that he had never even suspected before. And all this time, all of Henry's plans were being realized exactly as they were intended. Amber was not as patient as her comrades. She was looking for movement, but there was none. Henry had to convince the woman to stay put. Eventually, he managed to get through to her common sense. And, literally, a few minutes later, a characteristic noise was heard from one of the paths. The villains fell into a trap. They were going exactly where they were supposed to have the perfect ending to their lives. The explosion after stepping on a mine painted the horizon crimson. The elves, taken aback, crouched tensely at the bottom of the trench. But, in the next moment, the archers prepared for the second stage of the confrontation. It might seem strange, but Count Shane did not hear a sound. In addition to the rustling of tree leaves, despite the fact that they were located several kilometers from the explosion, he moved forward, clearly following the movement of the path and the tracks on the ground. The husband was not going to give up, even if the prince managed to travel a long distance from the city. Shane didn't want to tell anyone about his real plans, but his motivation could be the envy of every warrior in the pursuing squad. Meanwhile, on the lawn next to the fortifications, one explosion after another was heard. The rebel commander assessed the traps his soldiers had fallen into, believing it to be magic. The army could have missed the chance to catch up with the prince's column before serious natural obstacles appeared. For these reasons, it was decided to continue the assault, no matter the cost. All believers were to perceive death in battle as an honor, and not resist the demands of the command. To ease the soldiers' situation a little, flying monsters were brought in. But they too were powerless against the fire. In addition, it was precisely against such enemies that the White Rabbit's green traps were programmed. In order to aggravate the enemy's situation at the most difficult moment, the elves decided to start shelling. 100 arrows shot into the sky. Each of the villains who found themselves in the affected area received their share. Realizing that nothing could be achieved with a regular army, the commander decided to use the magic cores. Dark sorcerers also possessed fiery magic. They aimed straight at the trenches from which arrows were flying in their direction. This allowed the shelling to stop and the flying monsters to be released, after which the rebel leader ordered an attack on the enemy. Under the cover of the sorcerers, the infantry ran forward with weapons in their hands. The elves immediately began shooting the villains. Many of the rebels remained halfway to the first line of defense. The resulting pause allowed the defenders to retreat to the second trench. Naturally, such actions were perceived by the enemy as horror. But that's what Scott was hoping for. He was the last to leave cover and prepared a hellish surprise for the enemy, cutting through the barrels of grease with a sword. After which there was no one left on the first line of defense. The enemy army soldiers reached the trench within a few seconds. As soon as the first of them stepped to the bottom, he immediately realized that he was trapped. Along with him, many impatient devotees of the religion of the High Priestess became victims of the flame. Thus, the flame separated the second line of defense from the enemy. As long as the grease burned, none of the rebels could advance. Elves and humans could rest for a while. Fortunately, traps were set at every step, and this gave a whole day to gain for evacuation. The only thing that was stressful was that the enemies had no intention of stopping or turning back. The victims did not frighten them at all, and they had to exterminate the enemy route and branch to stop them. Henry saw only one way out of this situation, but he could not make a decision for everyone. Amber was interested in his proposal, but immediately noted that there would be no open confrontation. But the sniper did not insist on this. The gap in numbers was too great in their favor. He suggested doing something a little more cunning, taking advantage of the enemy's large numbers to his detriment. Everyone needed something to eat, even the rebels. Hunger must become the decisive lever in this confrontation. If the survival of the prince and the elven queen depended on it, Henry agreed to the treacherous step. The rebels decided to postpone the attack until the next day. They waited until the fire died down. Today, they managed to reach the third line of defense, but at night it became more difficult to advance. The commander insisted on pursuit, but it was impossible. They had been chasing the Imperial army in this forest for a day and a half already, but it was not possible to defeat the enemy even with a numerical advantage. This was annoying, considering that the enemy was simply shooting back from cover with arrows. And this turned out to be an effective defense, because the losses of troops per day were astounding. The soldiers' morale began to decline. After discussing everything with the chief mage of the unit, the commander gave permission to rest until the morning. Meanwhile, none of the rebels even suspected that they were being watched. The White Rabbit and Scott waited until their opponents went to bed, and Henry could finally rest. He had already forgotten the last time he slept. Although Amber suffered from constant doubts, she decided not to wake the man. But she went on to bombard Scott with questions. Henry's plan was for a small detachment of saboteurs to damage the enemy's food supply, and this had to be done more than once or twice. These must be the same constant provocations that the Vietnamese once staged against the Americans. This night should become a real hell for the rebels, exhausting them physically and morally. Activity at night will make it difficult to fight during the day, and the lack of food, or its shortage, puts additional pressure on the military's morale. After a couple more minutes of waiting, Henry announced that it was time to begin the offensive. He hoped that the element of surprise would work. Meanwhile, the prince, halfway to the gorge, looked at the sky with concern. Leroy tried to calm His Highness down. The guards had to keep watch around the camp all night. According to observations, there was no one in the area, and pursuit was avoided, but not worries about their people who were left behind. Suddenly, the conversation was interrupted by sentries who announced the arrival of the Allies. Leo was the first to jump up. He didn't understand how this was possible. Leroy tried to keep up with his height. The man was incited from within by thoughts of the possible betrayal of the new arrivals. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, the saboteurs were already hiding for the final forced march. They were in no hurry, taking a good look at the area. The White Rabbit acted as the main observer. It was at his signal that the first attack took place. The sorcerers and archers prepared to fire, just like Henry, hiding in one of the trees. It was decided to carry out the attack synchronously. There was neither time nor sense in building a complex strategy. The main factors in this case were panic, fear, and a sense of instability on the part of the enemy. The rebel army soldiers noticed their opponents too late. Within a moment, the saboteurs began to take the lives of the scoundrels. At the same time, Count Shane rode out of the darkness onto the lawn in front of Leo. The prince was incredibly happy to see his old friend. He, in turn, jumped off his horse and solemnly greeted the viceroy. As if ignoring all the words of the nobleman, the newcomer insisted on his guilt. He talked about how he failed to do his duty, but Leo kept repeating that everything was fine. Eventually, Leroy stopped the Count's stream of sycophancy. The man saw right through Shane and didn't like him at all. But this dislike was mutual. To at least diffuse the situation, Leo invited the Count to dinner, who arrived on time. The commander decided to keep an eye on the suspicious nobleman because he felt that he would do something bad. The raid was quite successful. Since the rebels had already gone to bed, they did not even have time to grab their weapons. Having killed the guards, Amber was the first to see the food warehouses. At her signal, Scott ordered his subordinates to set fire to the tents. The order was carried out with great pleasure. Half the camp was illuminated by the light of the flames of what had once been such delicious food. A rocket shot up into the sky behind us. This was a signal to retreat, and the detachment of saboteurs hurried to their positions. Of course, they began to persecute them, hoping to avenge the harm caused, but it was all in vain. Henry greeted the people with a joyful smile. The next sabotage was planned to take place in an hour. He had no doubt that this would be enough to make the rebels fall asleep again from fatigue. Thanks to this tactic, it was possible to win more than 2 days. The prince and the elven queen now have a good chance to reach the gorge without danger. Henry did everything in his power to protect his interests. A suspicious sound in the thicket behind immediately interrupted the peculiar meeting of comrades. Everyone looked around tensely, preparing for an armed clash with the enemy. The sorcerers generated fiery energy balls. But fortunately, there was no need to fight. None other than Kurt stepped out into the clearing, before the eyes of the astonished warriors. Henry was so shocked that he couldn't contain his feelings. The shy scout didn't know what to do with himself. He didn't expect to be greeted with such warmth. Only Amber looked at the newcomer with surprise. She couldn't understand how he got here. It turned out that reinforcements had been wandering around nearby the whole time, and now they had simply come to the flames. It was incredible luck that they ended up on this side of the clearing. Gradually, the two groups began to get to know each other. The remaining hours passed in conversation, and it was time for the second raid. Of course, the new arrivals did not understand the context of such actions. Scott simply assured that the essence of the mission was to sow chaos among the enemies, nothing more. But what struck Winston most was the way everyone present happily submitted to Henry's will. He immediately realized that in front of him was the very foreigner Kurt had spoken about. Now the curiosity within the Viscount increased several times. But Raymond, a vassal of Count Shane, only frowned even more. The man's face showed that he did not have warm feelings for the sniper. And this emotion could not be hidden from the observing Amber. The woman decided that she would not close her eyes that night. By morning, the column with the evacuees and the army of people reached the Crocina Gorge. The princess watched as the stone walls gradually surrounded her carriage and grew higher and higher. It's time to think about the safety of refugees. The prince asked Shane and Leroy what they thought. Both counts answered in the affirmative and proposed their own options for improving the defense. There were to be several lines of fortification inside and on the mountain. Leo agreed on all the details and ordered to begin preparations. Now his thoughts remained behind along with his comrades, who at the same time had to return from another raid to their positions. Kurt was so taken with the nighttime sabotage that he worried about his friends more than he should have. That's why I breathed a sigh of relief every time I saw them on the horizon. And now Scott appeared out of nowhere and instantly lifted the scout's spirits. The giant elf jumped to the ground and laughed joyfully. During this night, they managed to destroy more than they had initially hoped for. The rebels' provisions and barracks were burned down, and pursuit was now impossible. Henry's plan turned out to be more effective than those gathered yesterday believed. However, this was not the first time this had happened, so the Special Forces officer was already used to it. Unconventional approaches and new strategies challenged the imaginations of allies and opponents in conducting military operations. We could have talked endlessly, but the military man ordered us to leave our positions immediately and quickly. The fact that they destroyed the combat capability of a single unit did not mean complete victory. These soldiers were not the only source of possible force for the rebels. After thinking about the specialist's words for a while, everyone agreed with this decision. So no one was surprised when they saw an army of enemies behind them trying to catch up with them. Even at maximum speed, the detachment was unable to completely break away from pursuit. Because it wasn't people chasing them. Bloody Mason with an axe was already almost catching up with those who were less agile. So Winston had to engage in battle with him. This saved Scott's life. But the Viscount himself now needed help too. For the enemy was not alone. Amber immediately rushed at the monster, and with a few movements, took the life of one of them. After a kind of silent gratitude, the fortress manager decided to deal with the others himself. He attacked quickly and decisively. Kurt was seriously worried about her husband. He didn't want to lose another ally. But, fortunately, Winston was not a weak man. With one blow, the man cut the monster in half. This spectacle amazed everyone. Except for the warrior, she didn't want to play by the rules and lost her third enemy. Once the Bloody Masons were dealt with, it seemed like the squad had time, but it wasn't. Enemy dragon riders will appear in the sky. They noticed members of the Imperial Army from afar and were about to attack them. Unfortunately, among this group of villains, there were sorcerers. Therefore, the White Rabbit took over the defense of the unit and ordered his comrades to evade. Henry didn't want to leave his friend alone in danger, so he raised his rifle. With one shot, the sniper managed to mortally wound the dragon and the rider at the same time. The rest of the henchmen could only watch as their leader fell to the ground. The Special Forces officer decided to continue acting in this manner. But Amber stopped him. Everyone needed to move forward immediately. Despite this decision, Winston volunteered to deal with the urgent problem of detaining the enemy. This time Kurt didn't argue. Amber and the rest of the military continued moving towards the gorge. The pursuers didn't seem to be planning on letting up. Henry kept a constant watch on the dragon's movements from behind. This distracted the Special Forces from what was happening ahead. Amber managed to warn the sniper about the explosion in time. The soldier barely managed to get around him. For the first time, a man's life hung by a thread in this world. Edith and Emily explored the area they found themselves in. They walked along the gorge, but they still did not fully believe that they would be able to stay here in safety. Of course, it will be difficult for enemies to penetrate here. It is impossible to fight at full strength in a narrow space. Yes, there was another side to the coin. The supplies of the evacuees were not eternal. Elves and people could be killed by a siege. If it drags on for a long time, it will become almost impossible to survive. Emily tried her best to calm her queen. She insisted that reinforcements would arrive on time and, in any case, they would quit. All you had to do was keep yourself in check and remain calm while helping others. Eventually, Edith calmed down a little. Meanwhile, Leo continued to receive good news. One of the secret scouts brought news of additional reinforcements from the south. Baron Oliver agreed to come to the rescue, but the journey would take quite a long time. The nobleman understood that the siege of the gorge would then begin. Therefore, he was ready to attack opponents from outside if he received help from within. To do this, those who were building fortifications had to split up. Leroy understood that the need to form an additional detachment was inevitable. These people had to move for 15 days through the mountains to bring additional troops with them. Those who remain will have to endure all the disagreements that the rebel army will bring with it. It was a difficult decision, in whose defense, suddenly, Count Shane spoke out. Moreover, he volunteered to make this transition himself with a detachment of loyal people. Lara didn't like this idea. He believed that this was a useless diversion of personnel for an illusory purpose. The commander was even more irritated by Shane's reaction to all the comments. He behaved too insolently. Leo stopped the argument. He allowed the suspicious count to make a foray south. The prince had no intention of discussing his decision any further. It was difficult for him to get out of difficult situations, and at that moment, there was no one to rely on. Thanks to their rapid movement and maneuverability, Henry's detachment managed to break away from pursuit. They stopped at another clearing for a short rest. After a short meeting, it was decided to stay here for the night. The group decided to move only during the day, starting at dawn. People were needed to guard the perimeter, so a search began for those willing to do so. Raymond is a vassal of Count Shane and has volunteered to be responsible for the safety of others. When the full moon rose over the forest, all the soldiers, tired from endless attacks and operations, were already asleep. It was at this moment that the double agent's true face came to light. He stealthily approached Henry, who was sleeping peacefully under one of the giant trees. On the way, he had already dealt with several elves, and now it was the turn of the main enemy. The man had no hope at all that Amber would fulfill her promise to her own conscience. The woman did not close her eyes, despite her fatigue, and that is why she caught the traitor. The noise caused by the collision woke up everyone nearby. The Special Forces soldier had no idea what was going on. The first one to understand what was going on was Scott, who demanded an urgent explanation. But the scoundrel had not yet had time to recover from the warrior's blows. He raised his head with a smile after a few seconds and said what the others had already understood. The news of her collaboration with the High Priestess excited Amber to the point of bloodthirstiness. She rushed forward with the intent to kill, but Kurt's screams stopped that thirst. The scout understood that if the vassal acted on Isabel's orders, then his master did too. This truth was obvious, as confirmed by the sinister laughter of the sectarian. A second later, he pulled a dagger from his cuff. Having skillfully bypassed Amber, he continued moving towards his primary goal. But the woman did not allow the irreparable to happen. She pushed the scoundrel to the ground. He fell face down and gnashed his teeth. The second attack failed. The soldier, who was already known in the enemy camp, was still alive. Meanwhile, Kurt decided to leave this matter to the squad members. It was time to save the prince and everyone who was with him. There was no night left for rest. No one except the scout knew that at that moment, Count Shane was next to the viceroy. Since it was his fault, Kurt had to personally fix the situation. Something was also happening in the middle of the gorge. Princess Deborah came out of her tent at the conspirators' call. She moved carefully through the dark labyrinths of rock so as not to wake anyone. Only the woman calmed down, realizing that there was no one nearby. She saw suddenly the figure of a tall man materialize in front of her. He silently approached the princess, holding something in the right hand. Since the face was impossible to see, Deborah assumed it was a possible seizure. But the next moment, the palm opened and a diamond pendant fell out. At that very moment, the flame on the princess's bracelet burst into bright colors. The husband spoke. He hinted at the end of the path of betrayal of the empire. The woman feared for her life, because, according to the stranger, he didn't even suspect her identity. At that moment, Marcus, who was sleeping in the tent, suddenly woke up. The security guard responded to the shouts and immediately looked inside. Chris asked what was going on, and that's how the search for Deborah began. The boy and the warrior searched every corner of the camp. After 20 minutes of wandering, the man suddenly saw a bright light in one of the tents. He felt that all roads led there. Chris walked decisively inside, leaving the prince outside. And it turned out that the man did it for a reason. There were several dead bodies lying on the floor, over which stood Count Shane, a weapon in his hands. The prince's bodyguard immediately drew his sword, preparing to resist. The empire's best swordsman believed he could defeat the treacherous traitor. But he didn't take into account that Prince Marcus has an inquisitive nature. The boy ran into the tent because he heard voices. He thought his sister was there. But what he saw stopped his monologue mid-sentence and froze. Shane just smiled back, no longer afraid of being exposed.